being found upon him, locked up. This cell was in shape and size something like an area cellar, only not so light. It was most intolerably dirty, for it was Monday morning, and it had been tenanted by 6 drunken people, who had been locked up elsewhere since Saturday night. But this is little. In our station houses, men and women are every night confined on the most trivial charges. The word is worth noting, in dungeons, compared with which, those in Newgate, occupied by the most atrocious felons, tried, found guilty, and under sentence of death, are palaces. Let anyone who doubts this, compare the two. The old gentleman looked almost as rueful as Oliver when the key grated in the lock. He turned with a sigh to the book, which had been the innocent cause of all this disturbance. "There is something in that boy's face," said the old gentleman to himself as he walked slowly away, tapping his chin with the cover of the book, in a thoughtful manner, "something that touches and interests me. Can he be innocent? He looked like—" "By the by," exclaimed the old gentleman, halting very abruptly, and staring up into the sky, "bless my soul, where have I seen something like that look before?" After musing for some minutes, the old gentleman walked, with the same meditative face, into a back ante-room opening from the yard, and there, retiring into a corner, called up before his mind's eye a vast amphitheatre of faces over which a dusky curtain had hung for many years. "No," said the old gentleman, shaking his head, "it must be imagination." He wandered over them again. He had called them into view, and it was not easy to replace the shroud that had so long concealed them. There were the faces of friends, and foes, and of many that had been almost strangers peering intrusively from the crowd. There were the faces of young and blooming girls that were now old women. There were faces that the grave had changed and closed upon, but which the mind, superior to its power, still dressed in their old freshness and beauty, calling back the luster of the eyes, the brightness of the smile, the beaming of the soul through its mask of clay, and whispering of beauty beyond the tomb, changed but to be heightened, and taken from earth only to be set up as a light, to shed a soft and gentle glow upon the path to heaven. But the old gentleman could recall no one countenance of which Oliver's features bore a trace. So, he heaved a sigh over the recollections he awakened, and being, happily for himself, an absent old gentleman, buried them again in the pages of the musty book. He was roused by a touch on the shoulder, and a request from the man with the keys to follow him into the office. He closed his book hastily, and was at once ushered into the imposing presence of the renowned Mr. Fang. The office was a front parlor, with a panelled wall. Mr. Fang sat behind a bar, at the upper end, and on one side the door was a sort of wooden pen in which poor little Oliver was already deposited, trembling very much at the awfulness of the scene. Mr. Fang was a lean, long-backed, stiff-necked, middle-sized man, with no great quantity of hair, and what he had, growing on the back and sides of his head. His face was stern, and much flushed. If he were really not in the habit of drinking rather more than was exactly good for him, he might have brought action against his countenance for libel, and have recovered heavy damages. The old gentleman bowed respectfully, and advancing to the magistrate's desk, said, suiting the action to the word, "That is my name and address, sir." He then withdrew a pace or two, and, with another polite and gentlemanly inclination of the head, waited to be questioned. Now, it so happened that Mr. Fang was at that moment perusing a leading article in a newspaper of the morning, adverting to some recent decision of his, and commending him, for the 350th time, to the special and particular notice of the Secretary of State for the Home Department. He was out of temper, and he looked up with an angry scowl. "Who are you?" said Mr. Fang. The old gentleman pointed, with some surprise, to his card. "Officer," said Mr. Fang, tossing the card contemptuously away with the newspaper. "Who is this fellow?" "My name, sir," said the old gentleman, speaking like a gentleman, "my name, sir, is Brownlow." "Permit me to inquire the name of the magistrate who offers a gratuitous and unprovoked insult to a respectable person, under the protection of the bench." Saying this, Mr. Brownlow looked around the office as if in search of some person who would afford him the required information. "Officer," said Mr. Fang, throwing the paper on one side, "what's this fellow charged with?" "He's not charged at all, your worship," replied the officer. "He appears against this boy, your worship." His worship knew this perfectly well, but it was a good annoyance, and a safe one appears against the boy, does he? Said Mr. Fang, surveying Mr. Brownlow contemptuously from head to foot. Swear him. Before I am sworn, I must beg to say one word, said Mr. Brownlow, and that is, that I really never, without actual experience, could have believed. Hold your tongue, sir, said Mr. Fang, peremptorily. I will not, sir, replied the old gentleman. Hold your tongue this instant, or I'll have you turned out of the office, said Mr. Fang. You are an insolent, impertinent fellow. How dare you bully a magistrate? What? Exclaimed the old gentleman, reddening. Swear this person, said Fang to the clerk. I'll not hear another word. Swear him. Mr. Brownlow's indignation was greatly roused, but reflecting perhaps that he might only injure the boy by giving vent to it, he suppressed his feelings and submitted to be sworn at once. Now, said Fang, what's the charge against this boy? What have you got to say, sir? I was standing at a bookstall, Mr. Brownlow began. Hold your tongue, sir, said Mr. Fang. Policeman. Where's the policeman? Here. Swear this policeman. Now, policeman. What is this? The policeman, with becoming humility, related how he had taken the charge, how he had searched Oliver, and found nothing on his person, and how that was all he knew about it. Are there any witnesses? Inquired Mr. Fang. None, your worship, replied the policeman. Mr. Fang sat silent for some minutes, and then, turning round to the prosecutor, said in a towering passion, Do you mean to state what your complaint against this boy is, man, or do you not? You have been sworn. Now, if you stand there, refusing to give evidence, I'll punish you for disrespect to the bench. I will. By what, or by whom, nobody knows, for the clerk and jailer coughed very loud, just at the right moment, and the former dropped a heavy book upon the floor, thus preventing the word from being heard, accidentally, of course. With many interruptions, and repeated insults, Mr. Brownlow contrived to state his case, observing that, in the surprise of the moment, he had run after the boy because he had saw him running away, and expressing his hope that, if the magistrate should believe him, although not actually the thief, to be connected with the thieves, he would deal as leniently with him as justice would allow. He has been hurt already, said the old gentleman in conclusion, and I fear, he added, with great energy, looking towards the bar, I really fear that he is ill. Oh, yes, I dare say, said Mr. Fang, with a sneer. Come, none of your tricks here, you young vagabond. They won't do. What's your name? Oliver tried to reply, but his tongue failed him. He was deadly pale, and the whole place seemed turning round and round. What's your name, you hardened scoundrel? Demanded Mr. Fang. Officer, what's his name? This was addressed to a bluff old fellow, in a striped waistcoat, who was standing by the bar. He bent over Oliver, and repeated the inquiry, but finding him really incapable of understanding the question, and knowing that his not replying would only infuriate the magistrate the more, and add to the severity of his sentence, he hazarded a guess. He says his name's Tom White, your worship, said the kind-hearted thief-taker. Oh, he won't speak out, won't he? Said Fang. Very well, very well. Where does he live? Where he can, your worship, replied the officer, again pretending to receive Oliver's answer. Has he any parents? Inquired Mr. Fang. He says they died in his infancy, your worship, replied the officer, hazarding the usual reply. At this point of the inquiry, Oliver raised his head, and, looking round with imploring eyes, murmured a feeble prayer for a draught of water. Stuff and nonsense, said Mr. Fang. Don't try to make a fool of me. I think he really is ill, your worship, remonstrated the officer. I know better, said Mr. Fang. Take care of him, officer, said the old gentleman, raising his hands instinctively. He'll fall down. Stand away, officer, cried Fang. Let him, if he likes. Oliver availed himself of the kind permission, and fell to the floor in a fainting fit. The men in the office looked at each other, but no one dared to stir. I knew he was shamming, said Fang, as if this were incontestable proof of the fact. Let him lie there, he'll soon be tired of that. How do you propose to deal with the case, sir? Inquired the clerk in a low voice. Summarily, replied Mr. Fang. He stands committed for 3 months. Hard labor, of course. Clear the office. The door was opened for this purpose, and a couple of men were preparing to carry the insensible boy to his cell, when an elderly man of decent but poor appearance, clad in an old suit of black, rushed hastily into the office, and advanced towards the bench. "Stop! Stop! Don't take him away! For heaven's sake, stop a moment!" cried the newcomer, breathless with haste. Although the presiding genii in such an office as this exercise a summary and arbitrary power over the liberties, the good name, the character, almost the lives, of Her Majesty's subjects, especially of the poorer class, and although, within such walls, enough fantastic tricks are daily played to make the angels blind with weeping, they are closed to the public, save through the medium of the daily press, or were virtually. Then, Mr. Fang was consequently not a little indignant to see an unbidden guest enter in such irreverent disorder. "What is this? Who is this? Turn this man out! Clear the office!" cried Mr. Fang. "I will speak," cried the man. "I will not be turned out. I saw it all. I keep the bookstall. I demand to be sworn. I will not be put down." "Mr. Fang, you must hear me. You must not refuse, sir." The man was right. His manner was determined, and the matter was growing rather too serious to be hushed up. "Swear the man," growled Mr. Fang, with a very ill grace. "Now, man, what have you got to say?" "This," said the man. "I saw 3 boys, 2 others and the prisoner here, loitering on the opposite side of the way, when this gentleman was reading. The robbery was committed by another boy. I saw it done, and I saw that this boy was perfectly amazed and stupefied by it." Having by this time recovered a little breath, the worthy bookstall keeper proceeded to relate, in a more coherent manner, the exact circumstances of the robbery. "Why didn't you come here before?" said Fang, after a pause. "I hadn't a soul to mind the shop," replied the man. "Everybody who could have helped me had joined in the pursuit. I could get nobody till 5 minutes ago, and I've run here all the way." "The prosecutor was reading, was he?" inquired Fang, after another pause. "Yes," replied the man. "The very book he has in his hand." "Oh, that book, eh?" said Fang. "Is it paid for?" "No, it is not," replied the man, with a smile. "Dear me, I forgot all about it," exclaimed the absent old gentleman, innocently. "A nice person to prefer a charge against a poor boy," said Fang, with a comical effort to look humane. "I consider, sir, that you have obtained possession of that book, under very suspicious and disreputable circumstances, and you may think yourself very fortunate that the owner of the property declines to prosecute. Let this be a lesson to you, my man, or the law will overtake you yet. The boy is discharged." "Clear the office, d-n-me," cried the old gentleman, bursting out with the rage he had kept down so long. "D-n-me, I'll clear the office," said the magistrate. "Officers, do you hear? Clear the office." The mandate was obeyed, and the indignant Mr. Brownlow was conveyed out, with the book in one hand, and the bamboo cane in the other, in a perfect frenzy of rage and defiance. He reached the yard, and his passion vanished in a moment. Little Oliver Twist lay on his back on the pavement, with his shirt unbuttoned, and his temples bathed with water, his face a deadly white, and a cold tremble convulsing his whole frame. Poor boy," said Mr. Brownlow, bending over him. "Call a coach, somebody, pray." Directly a coach was obtained, and Oliver having been carefully laid on the seat, the old gentleman got in and sat himself on the other. "May I accompany you?" said the bookstall keeper, looking in. "Bless me, yes, my dear sir," said Mr. Brownlow quickly. "I forgot you. Dear, I have this unhappy book still. Jump in, poor fellow. There's no time to lose." The bookstall keeper got into the coach, and away they drove. Chapter 12, in which Oliver is taken better care of than he ever was before, and in which the narrative reverts to the merry old gentleman and his youthful friends. The coach rattled away, over nearly the same ground as that which Oliver had traversed when he first entered London in company with the Dodger, and, turning a different way when it reached the Angel at Islington, stopped at length before a neat house, in a quiet shady street near Pentonville. Here, a bed was prepared, without loss of time, in which Mr. Brownlow saw his young charge carefully and comfortably deposited, and here, he was tended with a kindness and solicitude that knew no bounds. But, for many days, Oliver remained insensible to all the goodness of his new friends. The sun rose and sank again, and many times after that, and still the boy lay stretched on his uneasy bed, dwindling away beneath the dry and wasting heat of fever. The worm does not work more surely on the dead body than does the slow creeping fire upon the living frame. Weak, and thin, and pallid, He awoke at last from what seemed to have been a long and troubled dream. Feebly raising himself in the bed, with his head resting on his trembling arm, he looked anxiously around. "What room is this? Where have I been brought to?" said Oliver. "This is not the place I went to sleep in." He uttered these words in a feeble voice, being very faint and weak, but they were overheard at once. The curtain at the bed's head was hastily drawn back, and a motherly old lady, very neatly and precisely dressed, rose as she undrew it, from an armchair close by, in which she had been sitting at needlework. "Hush, my dear," said the old lady softly. "You must be very quiet, or you will be ill again, and you have been very bad as bad could be, pretty nigh. Lie down again, there's a dear." With those words, the old lady very gently placed Oliver's head upon the pillow, and, smoothing back his hair from his forehead, looked so kindly and loving in his face, that he could not help placing his little withered hand in hers, and drawing it round his neck. "Save us," said the old lady, with tears in her eyes. "What a grateful little dear it is. Pretty creature! What would his mother feel if she had sat by him as I have, and could see him now?" "Perhaps she does see me," whispered Oliver, folding his hands together. "Perhaps she has sat by me. I almost feel as if she had." "That was the fever, my dear," said the old lady mildly. "I suppose it was," replied Oliver, "because heaven is a long way off, and they are too happy there to come down to the bedside of a poor boy. But if she knew I was ill, she must have pitied me, even there, for she was very ill herself before she died. She can't know anything about me though," added Oliver after a moment's silence. "If she had seen me hurt, it would have made her sorrowful, and her face has always looked sweet and happy when I have dreamed of her." The old lady made no reply to this, but wiping her eyes first, and her spectacles, which lay on the counterpane, afterwards, as if they were part and parcel of those features, brought some cool stuff for Oliver to drink, and then, patting him on the cheek, told him he must lie very quiet, or he would be ill again. So, Oliver kept very still, partly because he was anxious to obey the kind old lady in all things, and partly, to tell the truth, because he was completely exhausted with what he had already said. He soon fell into a gentle doze, from which he was awakened by the light of a candle, which, being brought near the bed, showed him a gentleman with a very large and loud ticking gold watch in his hand, who felt his pulse, and said he was a great deal better. "You are a great deal better, are you not, my dear?" said the gentleman. "Yes, thank you, sir," replied Oliver. "Yes, I know you are," said the gentleman. "You are hungry too, aren't you?" "No, sir," answered Oliver. "Hem," said the gentleman. "No, I know you're not." "He is not hungry, Mrs. Bedwin," said the gentleman, looking very wise. The old lady made a respectful inclination of the head, which seemed to say that she thought the doctor was a very clever man. The doctor appeared much of the same opinion himself. "You feel sleepy, don't you, my dear?" said the doctor. "No, sir," replied Oliver. "No," said the doctor, with a very shrewd and satisfied look. "You are not sleepy, nor thirsty, are you?" "Yes, sir, rather thirsty," answered Oliver. "Just as I expected, Mrs. Bedwin," said the doctor. "It's very natural that he should be thirsty. You may give him a little tea, ma'am, and some dry toast without any butter. Don't keep him too warm, ma'am, but be careful that you don't let him be too cold. Will you have the goodness?" The old lady dropped a curtsy. The doctor, after tasting the cool stuff, and expressing a qualified approval of it, hurried away, his boots creaking in a very important and wealthy manner as he went downstairs. Oliver dozed off again. Soon after this, when he awoke, it was nearly 12 o'clock. The old lady tenderly bade him good night shortly afterwards, and left him in charge of a fat old woman who had just come, bringing with her, in a little bundle, a small prayer book and a large nightcap. Putting the latter on her head and the former on the table, the old woman, after telling Oliver that she had come to sit up with him, drew her chair close to the fire and went off into a series of short naps, checkered at frequent intervals with sundry tumblings forward, and divers moans and chokings. These, however, had no worse effect than causing her to rub her nose very hard, and then fall asleep again. And thus the night crept slowly on. Oliver lay awake for some time, counting the little circles of light which the reflection of the rushlight shade threw upon the ceiling, or tracing with his languid eyes the intricate pattern of the paper on the wall. The darkness and the deep stillness of the room were very solemn, as they brought into the boy's mind the thought that death had been hovering there for many days and nights, and might yet fill it with the gloom and dread of his awful presence, he turned his face upon the pillow, and fervently prayed to heaven. Gradually, he fell into that deep tranquil sleep which ease from recent suffering alone imparts, that calm and peaceful rest which it is pain to wake from. Who, if this were death, would be roused again to all the struggles and turmoils of life, to all its cares for the present, its anxieties for the future, more than all, its weary recollections of the past. It had been bright day, for hours, when Oliver opened his eyes. He felt cheerful and happy. The crisis of the disease was safely past. He belonged to the world again. In 3 days' time he was able to sit in an easy chair, well propped up with pillows, and, as he was still too weak to walk, Mrs. Bedwin had him carried downstairs into the little housekeeper's room, which belonged to her. Having him set, here, by the fireside, the good old lady sat herself down too, and, being in a state of considerable delight at seeing him so much better, forthwith began to cry most violently. "Never mind me, my dear," said the old lady, "I'm only having a regular good cry. There, it's all over now, and I'm quite comfortable." "You are very, very kind to me, ma'am," said Oliver. "Well, never you mind that, my dear," said the old lady. "That's got nothing to do with your broth, and it's full time you had it, for the doctor says Mr. Brownlow may come in to see you this morning, and we must get up our best looks, because the better we look, the more he'll be pleased." And with this, the old lady applied herself to warming up, in a little saucepan, a basin full of broth, strong enough, Oliver thought, to furnish an ample dinner, when reduced to the regulation strength, for 350 paupers, at the lowest computation. "Are you fond of pictures, dear?" inquired the old lady, seeing that Oliver had fixed his eyes, most intently, on a portrait which hung against the wall, just opposite his chair. "I don't quite know, ma'am," said Oliver, without taking his eyes from the canvas. "I have seen so few that I hardly know what a beautiful, mild face that lady's is." "Ah," said the old lady, "painters always make ladies out prettier than they are, or they wouldn't get any custom. Child, the man that invented the machine for taking likenesses might have known that would never succeed. It's a deal too honest." "A deal," said the old lady, laughing very heartily at her own acuteness. Is that a likeness, ma'am?" said Oliver. "Yes," said the old lady, looking up for a moment from the broth. "That's a portrait." "Whose, ma'am?" asked Oliver. "Why, really, my dear, I don't know," answered the old lady in a good-humored manner. "It's not a likeness of anybody that you or I know, I expect. It seems to strike your fancy, dear." "It is so pretty," replied Oliver. "Why, sure you're not afraid of it?" said the old lady, observing in great surprise the look of awe with which the child regarded the painting. "Oh no, no," returned Oliver quickly, "but the eyes look so sorrowful, and where I sit, they seem fixed upon me. It makes my heart beat," added Oliver in a low voice, "as if it was alive, and wanted to speak to me, but couldn't." "Lord save us!" exclaimed the old lady, starting. "Don't talk in that way, child. You're weak and nervous after your illness. Let me wheel your chair round to the other side, and then you won't see it." "There," said the old lady, suiting the action to the word, "you don't see it now, at all events." Oliver did see it in his mind's eye as distinctly as if he had not altered his position, but he thought it better not to worry the kind old lady, so he smiled gently when she looked at him, and Mrs. Bedwin, satisfied that he felt more comfortable, salted and broke bits of toasted bread into the broth, with all the bustle befitting so solemn a preparation. Oliver got through it with extraordinary expedition. He had scarcely swallowed the last spoonful, when there came a soft rap at the door. "Come in," said the old lady, and in walked Mr. Brownlow. Now, the old gentleman came in as brisk as need be, but he had no sooner raised his spectacles on his forehead, and thrust his hands behind the skirts of his dressing gown to take a good long look at Oliver, than his countenance underwent a very great variety of odd contortions. Oliver looked very worn and shadowy from sickness, and made an ineffectual attempt to stand up, out of respect to his benefactor, which terminated in his sinking back into the chair again. And the fact is, if the truth must be told, that Mr. Brownlow's heart, being large enough for any 6 ordinary old gentlemen of humane disposition, forced a supply of tears into his eyes, by some hydraulic process which we are not sufficiently philosophical to be in a condition to explain. Poor boy, said Mr. Brownlow, clearing his throat. I'm rather hoarse this morning, Mrs. Bedwin. I'm afraid I have caught cold. I hope not, sir, said Mrs. Bedwin. Everything you have had has been well aired, sir. I don't know, Bedwin. I don't know, said Mr. Brownlow. I rather think I had a damp napkin at dinner time yesterday, but never mind that. How do you feel, my dear? Very happy, sir, replied Oliver. I'm very grateful indeed, sir, for your goodness to me. Goodbye, said Mr. Brownlow, stoutly. Have you given him any nourishment, Bedwin? Any slops, eh? He has just had a basin of beautiful strong broth, sir, replied Mrs. Bedwin, drawing herself up slightly, and laying strong emphasis on the last word, to intimate that between slops and broth well compounded, there existed no affinity or connection whatsoever. Ugh, said Mr. Brownlow, with a slight shudder, a couple of glasses of port wine would have done him a great deal more good. Wouldn't they, Tom White, eh? My name is Oliver, sir, replied the little invalid, with a look of great astonishment. Oliver, said Mr. Brownlow. Oliver what? Oliver White, eh? No, sir, Twist. Oliver Twist. Queer name, said the old gentleman. What made you tell the magistrate your name was White? I never told him so, sir, returned Oliver in amazement. This sounded so like a falsehood that the old gentleman looked somewhat sternly in Oliver's face. It was impossible to doubt him. There was truth in every one of its thin and sharpened lineaments. Some mistake, said Mr. Brownlow, but, although his motive for looking steadily at Oliver no longer existed, the old idea of the resemblance between his features and some familiar face came upon him so strongly that he could not withdraw his gaze. I hope you are not angry with me, sir, said Oliver, raising his eyes beseechingly. No, no, replied the old gentleman. Why, what's this, Bedwin? Look there. As he spoke, he pointed hastily to the picture over Oliver's head, and then to the boy's face. There was its living copy. The eyes, the head, the mouth, every feature was the same. The expression was, for the instant, so precisely alike, that the minutest line seemed copied with startling accuracy. Oliver knew not the cause of this sudden exclamation, for, not being strong enough to bear the start it gave him, he fainted away. A weakness on his part, which affords the narrative an opportunity of relieving the reader from suspense, in behalf of the two young pupils of the merry old gentleman, and of recording that when the Dodger and his accomplished friend Master Bates joined in the hue and cry which was raised at Oliver's heels, in consequence of their executing an illegal conveyance of Mr. Brownlow's personal property, as has been already described, they were actuated by a very laudable and becoming regard for themselves, and for as much as the freedom of the subject and the liberty of the individual are among the first and proudest boasts of a true-hearted Englishman, so, I need hardly beg the reader to observe, that this action should tend to exalt them in the opinion of all public and patriotic men, in almost as great a degree as this strong proof of their anxiety for their own preservation and safety goes to corroborate and confirm the little code of laws which certain profound and sound-judging philosophers have laid down as the mainsprings of all nature's deeds and actions, the said philosophers very wisely reducing the good lady's proceedings to matters of maxim and theory, and, by a very neat and pretty compliment to her exalted wisdom and understanding, putting entirely out of sight any considerations of heart, or generous impulse and feeling, for these are matters totally beneath the female who is acknowledged by universal admission to be far above the numerous little foibles and weaknesses of her sex. If I wanted any further proof of the strictly philosophical nature of the conduct of these young gentlemen in their very delicate predicament, I should at once find it in the fact, also recorded in a foregoing part of this narrative, of their quitting the pursuit, when the general attention was fixed upon Oliver, and making immediately for their home by the shortest possible cut. Although I do not mean to assert that it is usually the practice of renowned and learned sages, to shorten the road to any great conclusion, their course indeed being rather to lengthen the distance, by various circumlocutions and discursive staggerings, like unto those in which drunken men under the pressure of a too mighty flow of ideas, are prone to indulge. Still, I do mean to say, and do say distinctly, that it is the invariable practice of many mighty philosophers, in carrying out their theories, to evince great wisdom and foresight in providing against every possible contingency which can be supposed at all likely to affect themselves. Thus, to do a great right, you may do a little wrong, and you may take any means which the end to be attained will justify the amount of the right, or the amount of the wrong, or indeed the distinction between the two, being left entirely to the philosopher concerned, to be settled and determined by his clear, comprehensive, and impartial view of his own particular case. It was not until the two boys had scoured, with great rapidity, through a most intricate maze of narrow streets and courts, that they ventured to halt beneath a low and dark archway. Having remained silent here, just long enough to recover breath to speak, Master Bates uttered an exclamation of amusement and delight, and, bursting into an uncontrollable fit of laughter, flung himself upon a doorstep, and rolled thereon in a transport of mirth. "What's the matter?" inquired the Dodger. "Ha, ha, ha!" roared Charlie Bates. "Hold your noise," remonstrated the Dodger, looking cautiously round. "Do you want to be grabbed, stupid?" "I can't help it," said Charlie. "I can't help it." To see him splitting away at that pace, and cutting round the corners, and knocking up again the posts, and starting on again as if he was made of iron as well as them, and me with the wipe in my pocket, singing out after him, "Oh, my eye!" The vivid imagination of Master Bates presented the scene before him in too strong colours. As he arrived at this apostrophe, he again rolled upon the doorstep, and laughed louder than before. "What'll Fagin say?" inquired the Dodger, taking advantage of the next interval of breathlessness on the part of his friend to propound the question. "What?" repeated Charlie Bates. "Ah, what?" said the Dodger. "Why, what should he say?" inquired Charlie, stopping rather suddenly in his merriment, for the Dodger's manner was impressive. "What should he say?" Mr. Dawkins whistled for a couple of minutes, then, taking off his hat, scratched his head, and nodded thrice. "What do you mean?" said Charlie. "To-or-al-lollu, gammon and spinach, the frog he wouldn't, and high cockolorum," said the Dodger, with a slight sneer on his intellectual countenance. This was explanatory, but not satisfactory. Master Bates felt it so, and again said, "What do you mean?" The Dodger made no reply, but putting his hat on again, and gathering the skirts of his long-tailed coat under his arm, thrust his tongue into his cheek, slapped the bridge of his nose some half-dozen times in a familiar but expressive manner, and turning on his heel, slunk down the court. Master Bates followed, with a thoughtful countenance. The noise of footsteps on the creaking stairs, a few minutes after the occurrence of this conversation, roused the merry old gentleman as he sat over the fire with a saveloy and a small loaf in his hand, a pocket knife in his right, and a pewter pot in the trivet. There was a rascally smile on his white face as he turned round, and looking sharply out from under his thick red eyebrows, bent his ear towards the door, and listened. "Why, how's this?" muttered the Jew, changing countenance. "Only two of 'em. Where's the third? They can't have got into trouble." Hark! The footsteps approached nearer. They reached the landing. The door was slowly opened, and the Dodger and Charlie Bates entered, closing it behind them. Chapter 13. Some new acquaintances are introduced to the intelligent reader, connected with whom various pleasant matters are related, appertaining to this history. "Where's Oliver?" said the Jew, rising with a menacing look. "Where's the boy?" The young thieves eyed their preceptor as if they were alarmed at his violence, and looked uneasily at each other, but they made no reply. "What's become of the boy?" said the Jew, seizing the Dodger tightly by the collar, and threatening him with horrid imprecations. "Speak out, or I'll throttle you." Mr. Fagin looked so very much in earnest, that Charlie Bates, who deemed it prudent in all cases to be on the safe side, and who conceived it by no means improbable that it might be his turn to be throttled second, dropped upon his knees, and raised a loud, well-sustained, and continuous roar, something between a mad bull and a speaking trumpet. "Will you speak?" thundered the Jew, shaking the Dodger so much that his keeping in the big coat at all seemed perfectly miraculous. "Why, the traps have got him, and that's all about it," said the Dodger, sullenly. "Come, let go of me, will you?" And, swinging himself, at one jerk, clean out of the big coat, which he left in the Jew's hands, the Dodger snatched up the toasting fork, and made a pass at the merry old gentleman's waistcoat, which, if it had taken effect, would have let a little more merriment out than could have been easily replaced. The Jew stepped back in this emergency, with more agility than could have been anticipated in a man of his apparent decrepitude, and, seizing up the pot, prepared to hurl it at his assailant's head. But Charlie Bates, at this moment, calling his attention by a perfectly terrific howl, he suddenly altered its destination, and flung it full at that young gentleman. "Why, what the blazes is in the wind now?" growled a deep voice. "Who pitched that air at me?" "It's the beer, and not the pot, as hit me, or I'd have settled somebody. I might have knowed, as nobody but an infernal, rich, plundering, thundering old Jew could afford to throw away any drink but water, and not that, unless he done the river company every quarter." "What's it all about, Fagin?" Me, if my neck handkerchief ain't lined with beer." "Come in, you sneaking varmint. What are you stopping outside for, as if you was ashamed of your master? Come in." The man who growled out these words was a stoutly built fellow of about 35, in a black velveteen coat, very soiled drab breeches, lace-up half boots, and grey cotton stockings which enclosed a bulky pair of legs, with large swelling calves. The kind of legs, which in such costume, always look in an unfinished and incomplete state without a set of fetters to garnish them. He had a brown hat on his head, and a dirty belcher handkerchief round his neck, with the long frayed ends of which he smeared the beer from his face as he spoke. He disclosed, when he had done so, a broad heavy countenance with a beard of 3 days' growth, and 2 scowling eyes, one of which displayed various party-colored symptoms of having been recently damaged by a blow. "Come in, d'ye hear?" growled this engaging ruffian. A white shaggy dog, with his face scratched and torn in 20 different places, skulked into the room. "Why didn't you come in afore?" said the man. "You are getting too proud to own me afore company, are you?" "Lie down." This command was accompanied with a kick, which sent the animal to the other end of the room. He appeared well used to it, however, for he coiled himself up in a corner very quietly, without uttering a sound, and winking his very ill-looking eyes 20 times in a minute, appeared to occupy himself in taking a survey of the apartment. "What are you up to? Ill-treating the boys, you covetous, avaricious, insatiable old fence?" said the man, seating himself deliberately. "I wonder they don't murder you." "I would if I was them. If I'd been your apprentice, I'd have done it long ago, and, no, I couldn't have sold you afterwards, for you're fit for nothing but keeping as a curiosity of ugliness in a glass bottle, and I suppose they don't blow glass bottles large enough." "Hush, hush, Mr. Sykes," said the Jew, trembling, "don't speak so loud." "None of your mistering," replied the ruffian. "You always mean mischief when you come that. You know my name, out with it." "I shan't disgrace it when the time comes." "Well, then, Bill Sykes," said the Jew, with abject humility. "You seem out of humor, Bill." "Perhaps I am," replied Sykes. "I should think you was rather out of sorts too, unless you mean as little harm when you throw pewter pots about, as you do when you blab and—" "Are you mad?" said the Jew, catching the man by the sleeve, and pointing towards the boys. Mr. Sykes contented himself with tying an imaginary knot under his left ear, and jerking his head over on the right shoulder, a piece of dumb show which the Jew appeared to understand perfectly. He then, in cant terms, with which his whole conversation was plentifully besprinkled, but which would be quite unintelligible if they were recorded here, demanded a glass of liquor. "And mind you don't poison it," said Mr. Sykes, laying his hat upon the table. This was said in jest, but if the speaker could have seen the evil leer with which the Jew bit his pale lip as he turned round to the cupboard, he might have thought the caution not wholly unnecessary, or the wish, at all events, to improve upon the distiller's ingenuity not very far from the old gentleman's merry heart. After swallowing 2 or 3 glasses of spirits, Mr. Sykes condescended to take some notice of the young gentleman, which gracious act led to a conversation, in which the cause and manner of Oliver's capture was circumstantially detailed, with such alterations and improvements on the truth, as to the dodger appeared most advisable under the circumstances. "I'm afraid," said the Jew, "that he may say something which will get us into trouble." "That's very likely," returned Sykes with a malicious grin. "You were blowed upon, Fagin, and I'm afraid, you see," added the Jew, speaking as if he had not noticed the interruption, and regarding the other closely as he did so, "I'm afraid that, if the game was up with us, it might be up with a good many more, and that it would come out rather worse for you than it would for me." my dear." The man started, and turned round upon the Jew. But the old gentleman's shoulders were shrugged up to his ears, and his eyes were vacantly staring on the opposite wall. There was a long pause. Every member of the respectable coterie appeared plunged in his own reflections, not excepting the dog, who by a certain malicious licking of his lips seemed to be meditating an attack upon the legs of the first gentleman or lady he might encounter in the streets when he went out. "Somebody must find out what's been done at the office," said Mr. Sikes in a much lower tone than he had taken since he came in. The Jew nodded assent. "If he hasn't peached, and is committed, there's no fear till he comes out again," said Mr. Sikes, "and then he must be taken care on. You must get hold of him somehow." Again the Jew nodded. The prudence of this line of action, indeed, was obvious, but, unfortunately, there was one very strong objection to its being adopted. This was, that the Dodger, and Charlie Bates, and Fagin, and Mr. William Sikes, happened, one and all, to entertain a violent and deeply rooted antipathy to going near a police office on any ground or pretext whatever. How long they might have sat and looked at each other, in a state of uncertainty not the most pleasant of its kind, it is difficult to guess. It is not necessary to make any guesses on the subject, however, for the sudden entrance of the two young ladies whom Oliver had seen on a former occasion, caused the conversation to flow afresh. "The very thing," said the Jew. "That will go, won't you, my dear?" "Where's?" inquired the young lady. "Only just up to the office, my dear," said the Jew coaxingly. It is due to the young lady to say that she did not positively affirm that she would not, but that she merely expressed an emphatic and earnest desire to be blessed if she would, a polite and delicate evasion of the request, which shows the young lady to have been possessed of that natural good breeding which cannot bear to inflict upon a fellow creature the pain of a direct and pointed refusal. The Jew's countenance fell. He turned from this young lady, who was gaily, not to say gorgeously attired, in a red gown, green boots, and yellow curl papers, to the other female. "Nancy, my dear," said the Jew in a soothing manner, "what do you say?" "That it won't do, so it's no use trying it on, Fagin," replied Nancy. "What do you mean by that?" said Mr. Sikes, looking up in a surly manner. "What I say, Bill," replied the lady collectedly. "Why, you're just the very person for it," reasoned Mr. Sikes. "Nobody about here knows anything of you, and as I don't want 'em to, neither," replied Nancy in the same composed manner. "It's rather more no than yes with me, Bill." "She'll go, Fagin," said Sikes. "No, she won't, Fagin," said Nancy. "Yes, she will, Fagin," said Sikes. And Mr. Sikes was right. By dint of alternate threats, promises, and bribes, the lady in question was ultimately prevailed upon to undertake the commission. She was not, indeed, withheld by the same considerations as her agreeable friend, for, having recently removed into the neighbourhood of Field Lane from the remote but genteel suburb of Ratcliffe, she was not under the same apprehension of being recognized by any of her numerous acquaintances. Accordingly, with a clean white apron tied over her gown, and her curl papers tucked up under a straw bonnet, both articles of dress being provided from the Jew's inexhaustible stock, Miss Nancy prepared to issue forth on her errand. "Stop a minute, my dear," said the Jew, producing a little covered basket. "Carry that in one hand. It looks more respectable, my dear." "Give her a door key to carry in her t'other one, Fagin," said Sikes. "It looks real and genuine-like." "Yes, yes, my dear, so it does," said the Jew, hanging a large street door key on the forefinger of the young lady's right hand. "There, very good indeed, my dear," said the Jew, rubbing his hands. "Oh, my brother, my poor, dear, sweet, innocent little brother," exclaimed Nancy, bursting into tears, and wringing the little basket and the street door key in an agony of distress. "What has become of him? Where have they taken him to? Oh, do have pity, and tell me what's been done with the dear boy, gentlemen, do, gentlemen, if you please, gentlemen." Having uttered those words in a most lamentable and heartbroken tone, to the immeasurable delight of her hearers, Miss Nancy paused, winked to the company, nodded smilingly round, and disappeared. "Ah, she's a clever girl, my dears," said the Jew, turning round to his young friends, and shaking his head gravely, as if in mute admonition to them to follow the bright example they had just beheld. "She's a honour to her sex," said Mr. Sikes, filling his glass, and smiting the table with his enormous fist. "Here's her health," and wishing they was all like her. While these, and many other encomiums, were being passed on the accomplished Nancy, that young lady made the best of her way to the police office, whither, notwithstanding a little natural timidity consequent upon walking through the streets alone and unprotected, she arrived in perfect safety shortly afterwards. Entering by the back way, she tapped softly with the key at one of the cell doors, and listened. There was no sound within, so she coughed and listened again. Still there was no reply, so she spoke. "Nolly, dear," murmured Nancy in a gentle voice. "Nolly." There was nobody inside but a miserable shoeless criminal, who had been taken up for playing the flute, and who, the offence against society having been clearly proved, had been very properly committed by Mr. Fang to the House of Correction for 1 month, with the appropriate and amusing remark that since he had so much breath to spare, it would be more wholesomely expended on the treadmill than in a musical instrument. He made no answer, being occupied mentally bewailing the loss of the flute, which had been confiscated for the use of the county, so Nancy passed on to the next cell, and knocked there. "Well," cried a faint and feeble voice. "Is there a little boy here?" inquired Nancy, with a preliminary sob. "No," replied the voice, "God forbid." This was a vagrant of 65, who was going to prison for not playing the flute, or, in other words, for begging in the streets, and doing nothing for his livelihood. In the next cell was another man, who was going to the same prison for hawking tin saucepans without license, thereby doing something for his living, in defiance of the stamp office. But, as neither of these criminals answered to the name of Oliver, or knew anything about him, Nancy made straight up to the bluff officer in the striped waistcoat, and with the most piteous wailings and lamentations, rendered more piteous by a prompt and efficient use of the street door key and the little basket, demanded her own dear brother. "I haven't got him, my dear," said the old man. "Where is he?" screamed Nancy, in a distracted manner. "Why, the gentleman's got him," replied the officer. "What gentleman?" "Oh, gracious heavens! What gentleman?" exclaimed Nancy. In reply to this incoherent questioning, the old man informed the deeply affected sister that Oliver had been taken ill in the office, and discharged in consequence of a witness having proved the robbery to have been committed by another boy, not in custody, and that the prosecutor had carried him away, in an insensible condition, to his own residence, of and concerning which, all the informant knew was, that it was somewhere in Pentonville, he having heard that word mentioned in the directions to the coachman. In a dreadful state of doubt and uncertainty, the agonized young woman staggered to the gate, and then, exchanging her faltering walk for a swift run, returned by the most devious and complicated route she could think of, to the domicile of the Jew. Mr. Bill Sikes no sooner heard the account of the expedition delivered, than he very hastily called up the white dog, and, putting on his hat, expeditiously departed, without devoting any time to the formality of wishing the company good morning. "We must know where he is, my dears. He must be found," said the Jew, greatly excited. "Charlie, do nothing but skulk about, till you bring home some news of him. Nancy, my dear, I must have him found. I trust to you, my dear, to you and the artful for everything. Stay, added the Jew, unlocking a drawer with a shaking hand, "there's money, my dears. I shall shut up this shop tonight. You'll know where to find me. Don't stop here a minute. Not an instant, my dears." With these words, he pushed them from the room, and carefully double-locking and barring the door behind them, drew from its place of concealment the box which he had unintentionally disclosed to Oliver. Then, he hastily proceeded to dispose the watches and jewelry beneath his clothing. A rap at the door startled him in this occupation. "Who's there?" he cried in a shrill tone. "Me," replied the voice of the Dodger, through the keyhole. "What now?" cried the Jew impatiently. "Is he to be kidnapped to the other Ken, Nancy says?" inquired the Dodger. "Yes," replied the Jew. "Wherever she lays hands on him, find him out. That's all. I shall know what to do next. Never fear." The boy murmured a reply of intelligence, and hurried downstairs after his companions. "He has not peached so far," said the Jew as he pursued his occupation. "If he means to blab us among his new friends, we may stop his mouth yet." Chapter 14, comprising further particulars of Oliver's stay at Mr. Brownlow's, with the remarkable prediction which one Mr. Grimwig uttered concerning him, when he went out on an errand. Oliver, soon recovering from the fainting fit into which Mr. Brownlow's abrupt exclamation had thrown him, the subject of the picture was carefully avoided, both by the old gentleman and Mrs. Bedwin, in the conversation that ensued, which indeed bore no reference to Oliver's history or prospects, but was confined to such topics as might amuse without exciting him. He was still too weak to get up to breakfast, but, when he came down into the housekeeper's room next day, his first act was to cast an eager glance at the wall, in the hope of again looking on the face of the beautiful lady. His expectations were disappointed, however, for the picture had been removed. "Ah," said the housekeeper, watching the direction of Oliver's eyes. "It is gone, you see." "I see it is, ma'am," replied Oliver. "Why have they taken it away?" "It has been taken down, child, because Mr. Brownlow said that as it seemed to worry you, perhaps it might prevent your getting well, you know," rejoined the old lady. "Oh, no, indeed, it didn't worry me, ma'am," said Oliver. "I liked to see it. I quite loved it." "Well, well," said the old lady, good-humoredly, "you get well as fast as ever you can, dear, and it shall be hung up again. There, I promise you that. Now, let us talk about something else." This was all the information Oliver could obtain about the picture at that time. As the old lady had been so kind to him in his illness, he endeavored to think no more of the subject just then, so he listened attentively to a great many stories she told him, about an amiable and handsome daughter of hers, who was married to an amiable and handsome man, and lived in the country, and about a son, who was clerk to a merchant in the West Indies, and who was, also, such a good young man, and wrote such dutiful letters home 4 times a year, that it brought the tears into her eyes to talk about them. When the old lady had expatiated, a long time, on the excellences of her children, and the merits of her kind good husband besides, who had been dead and gone, poor dear soul, just 26 years, it was time to have tea. After tea she began to teach Oliver cribbage, which he learnt as quickly as she could teach, and at which game they played, with great interest and gravity, until it was time for the invalid to have some warm wine and water, with a slice of dry toast, and then to go cosily to bed. They were happy days, those of Oliver's recovery. Everything was so quiet, and neat, and orderly, everybody so kind and gentle, that after the noise and turbulence in the midst of which he had always lived, it seemed like heaven itself. He was no sooner strong enough to put his clothes on, properly, than Mr. Brownlow caused a complete new suit, and a new cap, and a new pair of shoes, to be provided for him. As Oliver was told that he might do what he liked with the old clothes, he gave them to a servant who had been very kind to him, and asked her to sell them to a Jew, and keep the money for herself. This she very readily did, and, as Oliver looked out of the parlor window, and saw the Jew roll them up in his bag and walk away, he felt quite delighted to think that they were safely gone, and that there was now no possible danger of his ever being able to wear them again. They were sad rags, to tell the truth, and Oliver had never had a new suit before. One evening, about a week after the affair of the picture, as he was sitting talking to Mrs. Bedwin, there came a message down from Mr. Brownlow, that if Oliver Twist felt pretty well, he should like to see him in his study, and talk to him a little while. "Bless us, and save us. Wash your hands, and let me part your hair nicely for you, child," said Mrs. Bedwin. "Dear heart alive, if we had known he would have asked for you, we would have put you a clean collar on, and made you as smart as sixpence." Oliver did as the old lady bade him, and, although she lamented grievously, meanwhile, that there was not even time to crimp the little frill that bordered his shirt collar, he looked so delicate and handsome, despite that important personal advantage, that she went so far as to say, looking at him with great complacency from head to foot, that she really didn't think it would have been possible, on the longest notice, to have made much difference in him for the better. Thus encouraged, Oliver tapped at the study door. On Mr. Brownlow calling to him to come in, he found himself in a little back room, quite full of books, with a window, looking into some pleasant little gardens. There was a table drawn up before the window, at which Mr. Brownlow was seated reading. When he saw Oliver, he pushed the book away from him, and told him to come near the table, and sit down. Oliver complied, marveling where the people could be found to read such a great number of books as seem to be written to make the world wiser, which is still a marvel to more experienced people than Oliver Twist, every day of their lives. There are a good many books, are there not, my boy? Said Mr. Brownlow, observing the curiosity with which Oliver surveyed the shelves that reached from the floor to the ceiling. A great number, sir, replied Oliver. I never saw so many. You shall read them, if you behave well, said the old gentleman kindly, and you will like that better than looking at the outsides, that is, some cases, because there are books of which the backs and covers are by far the best parts. I suppose they are those heavy ones, sir, said Oliver, pointing to some large quartos, with a good deal of gilding about the binding. Not always those, said the old gentleman, patting Oliver on the head, and smiling as he did so. There are other equally heavy ones, though of a much smaller size. How should you like to grow up a clever man, and write books, eh? And handsome daughter of hers, who was married to an amiable and handsome man, and lived in the country, and about a son, who was clerk to a merchant in the West Indies, and who was, also, such a good young man, and wrote such dutiful letters home 4 times a year, that it brought the tears into her eyes to talk about them. When the old lady had expatiated, a long time, on the excellences of her children, and the merits of her kind good husband besides, who had been dead and gone, poor dear soul, just 26 years, it was time to have tea. After tea she began to teach Oliver cribbage, which he learnt as quickly as she could teach, and at which game they played, with great interest and gravity, until it was time for the invalid to have some warm wine and water, with a slice of dry toast, and then to go cosily to bed. They were happy days, those of Oliver's recovery. Everything was so quiet, and neat, and orderly, everybody so kind and gentle, that after the noise and turbulence in the midst of which he had always lived, it seemed like heaven itself. He was no sooner strong enough to put his clothes on, properly, than Mr. Brownlow caused a complete new suit, and a new cap, and a new pair of shoes, to be provided for him. As Oliver was told that he might do what he liked with the old clothes, he gave them to a servant who had been very kind to him, and asked her to sell them to a Jew, and keep the money for herself. This she very readily did, and, as Oliver looked out of the parlour window, and saw the Jew roll them up in his bag and walk away, he felt quite delighted to think that they were safely gone, and that there was now no possible danger of his ever being able to wear them again. They were sad rags, to tell the truth, and Oliver had never had a new suit before. One evening, about a week after the affair of the picture, as he was sitting talking to Mrs. Bedwin, there came a message down from Mr. Brownlow, that if Oliver Twist felt pretty well, he should like to see him in his study, and talk to him a little while. Bless us, and save us. Wash your hands, and let me part your hair nicely for you, child, said Mrs. Bedwin. Dear heart alive, if we had known he would have asked for you, we would have put you a clean collar on, and made you as smart as sixpence. Oliver did as the old lady bade him, and, although she lamented grievously, meanwhile, that there was not even time to crimp the little frill that bordered his shirt collar, he looked so delicate and handsome, despite that important personal advantage, that she went so far as to say, looking at him with great complacency from head to foot, that she really didn't think it would have been possible, on the longest notice, to have made much difference in him for the better. Thus encouraged, Oliver tapped at the study door. On Mr. Brownlow calling to him to come in, he found himself in a little back room, quite full of books, with a window, looking into some pleasant little gardens. There was a table drawn up before the window, at which Mr. Brownlow was seated reading. When he saw Oliver, he pushed the book away from him, and told him to come near the table, and sit down. Oliver complied, marveling where the people could be found to read such a great number of books as seem to be written to make the world wiser, which is still a marvel to more experienced people than Oliver Twist, every day of their lives. There are a good many books, are there not, my boy? Said Mr. Brownlow, observing the curiosity with which Oliver surveyed the shelves that reached from the floor to the ceiling. A great number, sir, replied Oliver. I never saw so many. You shall read them, if you behave well, said the old gentleman kindly, and you will like that better than looking at the outsides, that is, some cases, because there are books of which the backs and covers are by far the best parts. I suppose they are those heavy ones, sir, said Oliver, pointing to some large quartos, with a good deal of gilding about the binding. "Not always those," said the old gentleman, patting Oliver on the head, and smiling as he did so. "There are other equally heavy ones, though of a much smaller size. How should you like to grow up a clever man, and write books, eh?" Mr. Brownlow smiled, and, turning to Oliver, said that Mr. Grimwig was an old friend of his, and he must not mind his being a little rough in his manners, for he was a worthy creature at bottom, as he had reason to know. "Shall I go downstairs, sir?" inquired Oliver. "No," replied Mr. Brownlow, "I would rather you remained here." At this moment, there walked into the room, supporting himself by a thick stick, a stout old gentleman, rather lame in one leg, who was dressed in a blue coat, striped waistcoat, nankeen breeches and gaiters, and a broad-brimmed white hat, with the sides turned up with green. A very small plaited shirt frill stuck out from his waistcoat, and a very long steel watch chain, with nothing but a key at the end, dangled loosely below it. The ends of his white neckerchief were twisted into a ball about the size of an orange. The variety of shapes into which his countenance was twisted defied description. He had a manner of screwing his head on one side when he spoke, and of looking out of the corners of his eyes at the same time, which irresistibly reminded the beholder of a parrot. In this attitude, he fixed himself, the moment he made his appearance, and, holding out a small piece of orange peel at arm's length, exclaimed, in a growling, discontented voice, "Look here, do you see this? Isn't it a most wonderful and extraordinary thing that I can't call at a man's house but I find a piece of this poor surgeon's friend on the staircase? I've been lamed with orange peel once, and I know orange peel will be my death, or I'll be content to eat my own head, sir." This was the handsome offer with which Mr. Grimwig backed and confirmed nearly every assertion he made, and it was the more singular in his case, because, even admitting for the sake of argument, the possibility of scientific improvements being brought to that pass which will enable a gentleman to eat his own head in the event of his being so disposed, Mr. Grimwig's head was such a particularly large one, that the most sanguine man alive could hardly entertain a hope of being able to get through it at a sitting. To put entirely out of the question, a very thick coating of powder. "I'll eat my head, sir," repeated Mr. Grimwig, striking his stick upon the ground. "Hello, what's that?" looking at Oliver, and retreating a pace or two. "This is young Oliver Twist, whom we were speaking about," said Mr. Brownlow. Oliver bowed. "You don't mean to say that's the boy who had the fever, I hope?" said Mr. Grimwig, recoiling a little more. "Wait a minute. Don't speak." "Stop," continued Mr. Grimwig, abruptly, losing all dread of the fever in his triumph at the discovery. "That's the boy who had the orange." "If that's not the boy, sir, who had the orange, and threw this bit of peel upon the staircase, I'll eat my head, and his too." "No, no, he has not had one," said Mr. Brownlow, laughing. "Come, put down your hat, and speak to my young friend." "I feel strongly on this subject, sir," said the irritable old gentleman, drawing off his gloves. "There's always more or less orange peel on the pavement in our street, and I know it's put there by the surgeon's boy at the corner. A young woman stumbled over a bit last night, and fell against my garden railings. Directly she got up I saw her look towards his infernal red lamp with the pantomime light. 'Don't go to him,' I called out of the window. 'He's an assassin, a man-trap.' So he is. If he is not—" Here the irascible old gentleman gave a great knock on the ground with his stick, which was always understood, by his friends, to imply the customary offer, whenever it was not expressed in words. Then, still keeping his stick in his hand, he sat down, and, opening a double eyeglass, which he wore attached to a broad black riband, took a view of Oliver, who, seeing that he was the object of inspection, coloured, and bowed again. "That's the boy, is it?" said Mr. Grimwig, at length. "That's the boy," replied Mr. Brownlow. "How are you, boy?" said Mr. Grimwig. "A great deal better, thank you, sir," replied Oliver. Mr. Brownlow, seeming to apprehend that his singular friend was about to say something disagreeable, asked Oliver to step downstairs and tell Mrs. Bedwin they were ready for tea, which, as he did not half like the visitor's manner, he was very happy to do. "He is a nice-looking boy, is he not?" inquired Mr. Brownlow. "I don't know," replied Mr. Grimwig, pettishly. Don't know? No, I don't know. I never see any difference in boys. I only knew two sort of boys, mealy boys and beef-faced boys. And which is Oliver? Mealy. I know a friend who has a beef-faced boy, a fine boy, they call him, with a round head, and red cheeks, and glaring eyes, a horrid boy, with a body and limbs that appear to be swelling out of the seams of his blue clothes, with the voice of a pilot, and the appetite of a wolf. I know him, the wretch. Come, said Mr. Brownlow, these are not the characteristics of young Oliver Twist, so he needn't excite your wrath. They are not, replied Mr. Grimwig. He may have worse. Here, Mr. Brownlow coughed impatiently, which appeared to afford Mr. Grimwig the most exquisite delight. He may have worse, I say, repeated Mr. Grimwig. Where does he come from? Who is he? What is he? He has had a fever. What of that? Fevers are not peculiar to good people, are they? Bad people have fevers sometimes, haven't they? Eh? I knew a man who was hung in Jamaica for murdering his master. He had had a fever 6 times. He wasn't recommended to mercy on that account. Pooh, nonsense. Now, the fact was, that in the inmost recesses of his own heart, Mr. Grimwig was strongly disposed to admit that Oliver's appearance and manner were unusually prepossessing, but he had a strong appetite for contradiction, sharpened on this occasion by the finding of the orange peel, and, inwardly determining that no man should dictate to him whether a boy was well-looking or not, he had resolved, from the first, to oppose his friend. When Mr. Brownlow admitted that on no one point of inquiry could he yet return a satisfactory answer, and that he had postponed any investigation into Oliver's previous history until he thought the boy was strong enough to hear it, Mr. Grimwig chuckled maliciously, and he demanded, with a sneer, whether the housekeeper was in the habit of counting the plate at night, because if she didn't find a tablespoon or two missing some sunshiny morning, why, he would be content to, and so forth. All this, Mr. Brownlow, although himself somewhat of an impetuous gentleman, knowing his friend's peculiarities, bore with great good humor, as Mr. Grimwig, at tea, was graciously pleased to express his entire approval of the muffins. Matters went on very smoothly, and Oliver, who made one of the party, began to feel more at his ease than he had yet done in the fierce old gentleman's presence. And when are you going to hear a full, true, and particular account of the life and adventures of Oliver Twist? Asked Grimwig of Mr. Brownlow, at the conclusion of the meal, looking sideways at Oliver, as he resumed his subject. Tomorrow morning, replied Mr. Brownlow. I would rather he was alone with me at the time. Come up to me tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, my dear. Yes, sir, replied Oliver. He answered with some hesitation, because he was confused by Mr. Grimwig's looking so hard at him. I'll tell you what, whispered that gentleman to Mr. Brownlow, he won't come up to you tomorrow morning. I saw him hesitate. He is deceiving you, my good friend. I'll swear he is not, replied Mr. Brownlow, warmly. If he is not, said Mr. Grimwig, and down went the stick. I'll answer for that boy's truth with my life, said Mr. Brownlow, knocking the table. And I for his falsehood with my head, rejoined Mr. Grimwig, knocking the table also. We shall see, said Mr. Brownlow, checking his rising anger. We will, replied Mr. Grimwig, with a provoking smile. We will. As fate would have it, Mrs. Bedwin chanced to bring in, at this moment, a small parcel of books, which Mr. Brownlow had that morning purchased of the identical bookstall keeper, who has already figured in this history. Having laid them on the table, she prepared to leave the room. Stop the boy, Mrs. Bedwin, said Mr. Brownlow. There is something to go back. He has gone, sir, replied Mrs. Bedwin. Call after him, said Mr. Brownlow. It's particular. He is a poor man, and they are not paid for. There are some books to be taken back, too. The street door was opened. Oliver ran one way, and the girl ran another, and Mrs. Bedwin stood on the step and screamed for the boy, but there was no boy in sight. Oliver and the girl returned, in a breathless state, to report that there were no tidings of him. Dear me, I am very sorry for that, exclaimed Mr. Brownlow. I particularly wished those books to be returned tonight. Send Oliver with them, said Mr. Grimwig, with an ironical smile. He will be sure to deliver them safely, you know. Yes, do let me take them, if you please, sir, said Oliver. I'll run all the way, sir." The old gentleman was just going to say that Oliver should not go out on any account, when a most malicious cough from Mr. Grimwig determined him that he should, and that, by his prompt discharge of the commission, he should prove to him the injustice of his suspicions, on this head at least, at once. "You shall go, my dear," said the old gentleman. "The books are on a chair by my table. Fetch them down." Oliver, delighted to be of use, brought down the books under his arm in a great bustle, and waited, cap in hand, to hear what message he was to take. "You are to say," said Mr. Brownlow, glancing steadily at Grimwig, "you are to say that you have brought those books back, and that you have come to pay the £4.10 I owe him. This is a £5 note, so you will have to bring me back 10 shillings change." "I won't be 10 minutes, sir," said Oliver, eagerly. Having buttoned up the bank note in his jacket pocket, and placed the books carefully under his arm, he made a respectful bow, and left the room. Mrs. Bedwin followed him to the street door, giving him many directions about the nearest way, and the name of the bookseller, and the name of the street, all of which Oliver said he clearly understood. Having superadded many injunctions to be sure and not take cold, the old lady at length permitted him to depart. "Bless his sweet face," said the old lady, looking after him. "I can't bear, somehow, to let him go out of my sight." At this moment, Oliver looked gaily round, and nodded before he turned the corner. The old lady smilingly returned his salutation, and, closing the door, went back to her own room. "Let me see, he'll be back in 20 minutes, at the longest," said Mr. Brownlow, pulling out his watch, and placing it on the table. "It will be dark by that time." "Oh, you really expect him to come back, do you?" inquired Mr. Grimwig. "Don't you?" asked Mr. Brownlow, smiling. The spirit of contradiction was strong in Mr. Grimwig's breast, at the moment, and it was rendered stronger by his friend's confident smile. "No," he said, smiting the table with his fist, "I do not." The boy has a new suit of clothes on his back, a set of valuable books under his arm, and a £5 note in his pocket. He'll join his old friends the thieves, and laugh at you. If ever that boy returns to this house, sir, I'll eat my head." With these words he drew his chair closer to the table, and there the two friends sat, in silent expectation, with the watch between them. It is worthy of remark, as illustrating the importance we attach to our own judgments, and the pride with which we put forth our most rash and hasty conclusions, that, although Mr. Grimwig was not by any means a bad-hearted man, and though he would have been unfeignedly sorry to see his respected friend duped and deceived, he really did most earnestly and strongly hope at that moment that Oliver Twist might not come back. It grew so dark that the figures on the dial plate were scarcely discernible, but there the two old gentlemen continued to sit, in silence, with the watch between them. Chapter 15, showing how very fond of Oliver Twist the merry old Jew and Miss Nancy were. In the obscure parlour of a low public house, in the filthiest part of Little Saffron Hill, a dark and gloomy den, where a flaring gaslight burnt all day in the winter time, and where no ray of sun ever shone in the summer, there sat, brooding over a little pewter measure and a small glass, strongly impregnated with the smell of liquor, a man in a velveteen coat, drab shorts, half boots and stockings, whom even by that dim light no experienced agent of the police would have hesitated to recognize as Mr. William Sikes. At his feet sat a white-coated, red-eyed dog, who occupied himself, alternately, in winking at his master with both eyes at the same time, and in licking a large, fresh cut on one side of his mouth, which appeared to be the result of some recent conflict. "Keep quiet, you varmint, keep quiet," said Mr. Sikes, suddenly breaking silence. Whether his meditations were so intense as to be disturbed by the dog's winking, or whether his feelings were so wrought upon by his reflections that they required all the relief derivable from kicking an unoffending animal to allay them, is matter for argument and consideration. Whatever was the cause, the effect was a kick and a curse, bestowed upon the dog simultaneously. Dogs are not generally apt to revenge injuries inflicted upon them by their masters, but Mr. Sikes's dog, having faults of temper in common with his owner, and laboring, perhaps, at this moment, under a powerful sense of injury, made no more ado but at once fixed his teeth in one of the half-boots. Having given in a hearty shake, he retired, growling, under a form, just escaping the pewter measure which Mr. Sikes leveled at his head. "You would you?" said Sikes, seizing the poker in one hand, and deliberately opening with the other a large clasp knife, which he drew from his pocket. "Come here, you born devil, come here, d'ye hear?" The dog no doubt heard, because Mr. Sikes spoke in the very harshest key of a very harsh voice, but, appearing to entertain some unaccountable objection to having his throat cut, he remained where he was, and growled more fiercely than before, at the same time grasping the end of the poker between his teeth, and biting at it like a wild beast. This resistance only infuriated Mr. Sikes the more, who, dropping on his knees, began to assail the animal most furiously. The dog jumped from right to left, and from left to right, snapping, growling, and barking. The man thrust and swore, and struck and blasphemed, and the struggle was reaching a most critical point for one or other, when, the door suddenly opening, the dog darted out, leaving Bill Sikes with the poker and the clasp knife in his hands. "There must always be two parties to a quarrel," says the old adage. Mr. Sikes, being disappointed of the dog's participation, at once transferred his share in the quarrel to the newcomer. "What the devil do you come in between me and my dog for?" said Sikes, with a fierce gesture. "I didn't know, my dear, I didn't know," replied Fagin, humbly, for the Jew was the newcomer. "Didn't know, you white-livered thief," growled Sikes. "Couldn't you hear the noise?" "Not a sound of it, as I'm a living man, Bill," replied the Jew. "Oh no, you hear nothing, you don't," retorted Sikes with a fierce sneer, "sneaking in and out, so as nobody hears how you come or go. I wish you had been the dog, Fagin, half a minute ago." "Why?" inquired the Jew with a forced smile. "'Cause the government, as cares for the lives of such men as you, as haven't half the pluck of curs, lets a man kill a dog how he likes," replied Sikes, shutting up the knife with a very expressive look. "That's why." The Jew rubbed his hands, and, sitting down at the table, affected to laugh at the pleasantry of his friend. He was obviously very ill at ease, however. "Grin away," said Sikes, replacing the poker, and surveying him with savage contempt. "Grin away. You'll never have the laugh at me, though, unless it's behind a nightcap. I've got the upper hand over you, Fagin, and, me, I'll keep it. There. If I go, you go, so take care of me." Well, my dear," said the Jew, "I know all that. We have a mutual interest, Bill." "A mutual interest, Humphrey," said Sikes, as if he thought the interest lay rather more on the Jew's side than on his. "Well, what have you got to say to me?" "It's all passed safe through the melting pot," replied Fagin, "and this is your share." "It's rather more than it ought to be, my dear, but as I know you'll do me a good turn another time, and—" "Stow that gammon," interposed the robber, impatiently. "Where is it?" "Hand over." Yes, Bill, give me time, replied the Jew, soothingly. "Here it is, all safe." As he spoke, he drew forth an old cotton handkerchief from his breast, and untying a large knot in one corner, produced a small brown paper packet. Sikes, snatching it from him, hastily opened it, and proceeded to count the sovereigns it contained. "This is all, is it?" inquired Sikes. "All," replied the Jew. "You haven't opened the parcel and swallowed one or two as you come along, have you?" inquired Sikes, suspiciously. "Don't put on an injured look at the question, you've done it many a time," jerked the tinkerer. These words, in plain English, conveyed an injunction to ring the bell. It was answered by another Jew, younger than Fagin, but nearly as vile and repulsive in appearance. Bill Sikes merely pointed to the empty measure. The Jew, perfectly understanding the hint, retired to fill it, previously exchanging a remarkable look with Fagin, who raised his eyes for an instant, as if in expectation of it, and shook his head in reply, so slightly that the action would have been almost imperceptible to an observant third person. It was lost upon Sikes, who was stooping at the moment to tie the bootlace which the dog had torn. Possibly, if he had observed the brief interchange of signals, he might have thought that it boded no good to him. "Is anybody here, Barney?" inquired Fagin, speaking, now that Sikes was looking on, without raising his eyes from the ground. "Daughter-shul," replied Barney, whose words, whether they came from the heart or not, made their way through the nose. "Nobody?" inquired Fagin, in a tone of surprise, which perhaps might mean that Barney was at liberty to tell the truth. "Nobody but Bistadsy," replied Barney. "Nancy," exclaimed Sikes. "Where? Strike me blind, if I don't honor that 'ere girl for her native talents." "She's bid have a plate of boiled beef at the bar," replied Barney. "Send her here," said Sikes, pouring out a glass of liquor. "Send her here." Barney looked timidly at Fagin, as if for permission. The Jew remaining silent, and not lifting his eyes from the ground, he retired, and presently returned, ushering in Nancy, who was decorated with the bonnet, apron, basket, and street door key, complete. "You are on the scent, are you, Nancy?" inquired Sikes, proffering the glass. "Yes, I am, Bill," replied the young lady, disposing of its contents. "Untired enough of it I am, too." The young brat's been ill and confined to the crib, and, Nancy, dear," said Fagin, looking up. Now, whether a peculiar contraction of the Jew's red eyebrows, and a half-closing of his deeply set eyes, warned Miss Nancy that she was disposed to be too communicative, is not a matter of much importance. The fact is all we need care for here, and the fact is, that she suddenly checked herself, and with several gracious smiles upon Mr. Sikes, turned the conversation to other matters. In about 10 minutes' time, Mr. Fagin was seized with a fit of coughing, upon which Nancy pulled her shawl over her shoulders, and declared it was time to go. Mr. Sikes, finding that he was walking a short part of her way himself, expressed his intention of accompanying her. They went away together, followed, at a little distance, by the dog, who slunk out of a backyard as soon as his master was out of sight. The Jew thrust his head out of the room door when Sikes had left it, looked after him as we walked up the dark passage, shook his clenched fist, muttered a deep curse, and then, with a horrible grin, reseated himself at the table, where he was soon deeply absorbed in the interesting pages of the hue and cry. Meanwhile, Oliver Twist, little dreaming that he was within so very short a distance of the merry old gentleman, was on his way to the bookstall. When he got into Clerkenwell, he accidentally turned down a by-street which was not exactly in his way, but not discovering his mistake until he had got halfway down it, and knowing it must lead in the right direction, he did not think it worthwhile to turn back, and so marched on, as quickly as he could, with the books under his arm. He was walking along, thinking how happy and contented he ought to feel, and how much he would give for only one look at poor little Dick, who, starved and beaten, might be weeping bitterly at that very moment, when he was startled by a young woman screaming out very loud, "Oh, my dear brother!" And he had hardly looked up, to see what the matter was, when he was stopped by having a pair of arms thrown tight round his neck. "Don't!" cried Oliver, struggling. "Let go of me." "Who is it? What are you stopping me for?" The only reply to this was a great number of loud lamentations from the young woman who had embraced him, and who had a little basket and a street door key in her hand. "Oh my gracious," said the young woman, "I have found him." "Oh, Oliver, Oliver, oh you naughty boy, to make me suffer such distress on your account. Come home, dear, come." "Oh, I've found him. Thank gracious goodness heavens, I've found him." With these incoherent exclamations, the young woman burst into another fit of crying, and got so dreadfully hysterical, that a couple of women who came up at the moment asked a butcher's boy with a shiny head of hair anointed with suet, who was also looking on, whether he didn't think he had better run for the doctor. To which, the butcher's boy, who appeared of a lounging, not to say indolent disposition, replied, that he thought not. "Oh, no, no, never mind," said the young woman, grasping Oliver's hand, "I'm better now. Come home directly, you cruel boy, come." "Oh, ma'am," replied the young woman, "he ran away, near a month ago, from his parents, who are hard-working and respectable people, and went and joined a set of thieves and bad characters, and almost broke his mother's heart." "Young wretch," said one woman. "Go home, do, you little brute," said the other. "I am not," replied Oliver, greatly alarmed. "I don't know her. I haven't any sister, or father and mother either. I'm an orphan. I live at Pentonville." "Only hear him, how he braves it out," cried the young woman. "Why, it's Nancy," exclaimed Oliver, who now saw her face for the first time, and started back, in irrepressible astonishment. "You see he knows me," cried Nancy, appealing to the bystanders. "He can't help himself. Make him come home, there's good people, or he'll kill his dear mother and father, and break my heart." "What the devil's this?" said a man, bursting out of a beer shop, with a white dog at his heels. "Young Oliver, come home to your poor mother, you young dog. Come home directly. I don't belong to them. I don't know them." "Help, help," cried Oliver, struggling in the man's powerful grasp. "Help," repeated the man. "Yes, I'll help you, you young rascal. What books are these? You've been stealing 'em, have you? Give 'em here." With these words, the man tore the volumes from his grasp, and struck him on the head. "That's right," cried a looker-on from a garret window. "That's the only way of bringing him to his senses." "To be sure," cried a sleepy-faced carpenter, casting an approving look at the garret window. "It'll do him good," said the two women. "And he shall have it, too," rejoined the man, administering another blow, and seizing Oliver by the collar. "Come on, you young villain. Here, Bullseye, mind him, boy, mind him." Weak with recent illness, stupefied by the blows and the suddenness of the attack, terrified by the fierce growling of the dog, and the brutality of the man, overpowered by the conviction of the bystanders that he really was the hardened little wretch he was described to be, what could one poor child do? Darkness had set in. It was a low neighborhood. No help was near. Resistance was useless. In another moment he was dragged into a labyrinth of dark narrow courts, and was forced along them at a pace which rendered the few cries he dared to give utterance to unintelligible. It was of little moment, indeed, whether they were intelligible or no, for there was nobody to care for them, had they been ever so plain. The gas lamps were lighted. Mrs. Bedwin was waiting anxiously at the open door. The servant had run up the street 20 times to see if there were any traces of Oliver, and still the two old gentlemen sat, perseveringly, in the dark parlor, with the watch between them. Chapter 16 relates what became of Oliver Twist, after he had been claimed by Nancy. The narrow streets and courts, at length, terminated in a large open space, scattered about which were pens for beasts, and other indications of a cattle market. Sikes slackened his pace when they reached this spot, the girl being quite unable to support any longer the rapid rate at which they had hitherto walked. Turning to Oliver, he roughly commanded him to take hold of Nancy's hand. "Do you hear?" growled Sikes, as Oliver hesitated, and looked round. They were in a dark corner, quite out of the track of passengers. Oliver saw, but too plainly, that resistance would be of no avail. He held out his hand, which Nancy clasped tight in hers. "Give me the other," said Sikes, seizing Oliver's unoccupied hand. "Here, Bullseye." The dog looked up, and growled. "See here, boy," said Sikes, putting his other hand to Oliver's throat. "If he speaks ever so soft a word, hold him." "D'ye mind?" The dog growled again, and licking his lips, eyed Oliver as if he were anxious to attach himself to his windpipe without delay. "He's as willing as a Christian, strike me blind if he isn't," said Sikes, regarding the animal with a kind of grim and ferocious approval. "Now, you know what you've got to expect, master, so call away as quick as you like. The dog will soon stop that game. Get on, young gun." Bullseye wagged his tail in acknowledgement of this unusually endearing form of speech, and, giving vent to another admonitory growl for the benefit of Oliver, led the way onward. It was Smithfield that they were crossing, although it might have been Grosvenor Square, for anything Oliver knew to the contrary. The night was dark and foggy. The lights in the shops could scarcely struggle through the heavy mist, which thickened every moment and shrouded the streets and houses in gloom, rendering the strange place still stranger in Oliver's eyes, and making his uncertainty the more dismal and depressing. They had hurried on a few paces, when a deep church bell struck the hour. With its first stroke, his two conductors stopped, and turned their heads in the direction whence the sound proceeded. "8 o'clock, Bill," said Nancy, when the bell ceased. "What's the good of telling me that? I can hear it, can't I?" replied Sikes. "I wonder whether they can hear it," said Nancy. "Of course they can," replied Sikes. "It was Bartlemy time when I was shopped, and there won't a penny trumpet in the fair, as I couldn't hear the squeaking on. Arter I was locked up for the night, the row and din outside made the thundering old jail so silent, that I could almost have beat my brains out against the iron plates of the door." "Poor fellow," said Nancy, who still had her face turned towards the quarter in which the bell had sounded. "Oh, Bill, such fine young chaps as them." "Yes, that's all you women think of," answered Sikes. "Fine young chaps. Well, they're as good as dead. so it don't much matter. With this consolation, Mr. Sykes appeared to repress a rising tendency to jealousy, and, clasping Oliver's wrist more firmly, told him to step out again. "Wait a minute," said the girl. "I wouldn't hurry by, if it was you that was coming out to be hung. The next time 8 o'clock struck, Bill, I'd walk round and round the place till I dropped. If the snow was on the ground, and I hadn't a shawl to cover me." "And what good would that do?" inquired the unsentimental Mr. Sykes. "Unless you could pitch over a file and 20 yards of good stout rope, you might as well be walking 50 mile off, or not walking at all, for all the good it would do me. Come on, and don't stand preaching there." The girl burst into a laugh, drew her shawl more closely round her, and they walked away. But Oliver felt her hand tremble, and, looking up in her face as they passed a gas lamp, saw that it had turned a deadly white. They walked on, by little frequented and dirty ways, for a full half hour, meeting very few people, and those appearing from their looks to hold much the same position in society as Mr. Sykes himself. At length they turned into a very filthy narrow street, nearly full of old clothes shops, the dog running forward, as if conscious that there was no further occasion for his keeping on guard, stopped before the door of a shop that was closed and apparently untenanted. The house was in a ruinous condition, and on the door was nailed a board, intimating that it was to let, which looked as if it had hung there for many years. "All right," cried Sykes, glancing cautiously about. Nancy stooped below the shutters, and Oliver heard the sound of a bell. They crossed to the opposite side of the street, and stood for a few moments under a lamp. A noise, as if a sash window were gently raised, was heard, and soon afterwards the door softly opened. Mr. Sykes then seized the terrified boy by the collar with very little ceremony, and all three were quickly inside the house. The passage was perfectly dark. They waited, while the person who had let them in, chained and barred the door. "Anybody here?" inquired Sykes. "No," replied a voice, which Oliver thought he had heard before. "Is the old un here?" asked the robber. "Yes," replied the voice. "Unprecious down in the mouth he has been." "Won't he be glad to see you?" "Oh, no." The style of this reply, as well as the voice which delivered it, seemed familiar to Oliver's ears, but it was impossible to distinguish even the form of the speaker in the darkness. "Let's have a glim," said Sykes, "or we shall go breaking our necks, or treading on the dog." "Look after your legs if you do." "Stand still a moment, and I'll get you one," replied the voice. The receding footsteps of the speaker were heard, and, in another minute, the form of Mr. John Dickens, otherwise the Artful Dodger, appeared. He bore in his right hand a tallow candle stuck in the end of a cleft stick. The young gentleman did not stop to bestow any other mark of recognition upon Oliver than a humorous grin, but, turning away, beckoned the visitors to follow him down a flight of stairs. They crossed an empty kitchen, and, opening the door of a low earthy-smelling room, which seemed to have been built in a small backyard, were received with a shout of laughter. "Oh, my wig, cried Master Charles Bates, from whose lungs the laughter had proceeded. "Here he is." "Oh, here he is." "Oh, Fagin, look at him." "Fagin, do look at him." "I can't bear it. It is such a jolly game. I can't bear it. Hold me, somebody, while I laugh it out." With this irrepressible ebullition of mirth, Master Bates laid himself flat on the floor, and kicked convulsively for 5 minutes, in an ecstasy of facetious joy. Then jumping to his feet, he snatched the cleft stick from the Dodger, and, advancing to Oliver, viewed him round and round, while the Jew, taking off his nightcap, made a great number of low bows to the bewildered boy. The Artful, meantime, who was of a rather saturnine disposition, and seldom gave way to merriment when it interfered with business, rifled Oliver's pockets with steady assiduity. "Look at his togs, Fagin," said Charlie, putting the light so close to his new jacket as nearly to set him on fire. "Look at his togs, superfine cloth, and the heavy swell cut. Oh, my eye, what a game! And his books, too." "Nothing but a gentleman, Fagin." "Delighted to see you looking so well, my dear," said the Jew, bowing with mock humility. "The Artful shall give you another suit, my dear, for fear you should spoil that Sunday one. Why didn't you write, my dear, and say you were coming? We'd have got something warm for supper." At his, Master Bates roared again, so loud, that Fagin himself relaxed, and even the Dodger smiled. But as the Artful drew forth the £5 note at that instant, it is doubtful whether the sally of the discovery awakened his merriment. Hello, what's that? Inquired Sikes, stepping forward as the Jew seized the note. That's mine, Fagin. No, no, my dear, said the Jew. Mine, Bill, mine. You shall have the books. If that ain't mine, said Bill Sikes, putting on his hat with a determined air. Mine and Nancy's, that is. I'll take the boy back again. The Jew started. Oliver started too, though from a very different cause, for he hoped that the dispute might really end in his being taken back. Come, hand over, will you? Said Sikes. This is hardly fair, Bill. Hardly fair, is it, Nancy? Inquired the Jew. Fair, or not fair, retorted Sikes. Hand over, I tell you. Do you think Nancy and me has got nothing else to do with our precious time but to spend it in scouting arter, and kidnapping every young boy as gets grabbed through you? Give it here, you avaricious old skeleton, give it here. With this gentle remonstrance, Mr. Sikes plucked the note from between the Jew's finger and thumb, and looking the old man coolly in the face, folded it up small, and tied it in his neckerchief. That's for our share of the trouble, said Sikes, and not half enough, neither. You may keep the books, if you're fond of reading. If you ain't, sell 'em. They're very pretty, said Charlie Bates, who, with sundry grimaces, had been affecting to read one of the volumes in question. Beautiful writing, isn't his, Oliver? At sight of the dismayed look with which Oliver regarded his tormentors, Master Bates, who was blessed with a lively sense of the ludicrous, fell into another ecstasy, more boisterous than the first. They belong to the old gentleman, said Oliver, wringing his hands, to the good, kind, old gentleman who took me into his house, and had me nursed, when I was near dying of the fever. Oh, pray send him back the books and money. Keep me here all my life long, but pray send them back. He'll think I stole them, the old lady, all of them who were so kind to me, will think I stole them. Oh, do have mercy upon me, and send them back. With these words, which were uttered with all the energy of passionate grief, Oliver fell upon his knees at the Jew's feet, and beat his hands together, in perfect desperation. The boy's right, remarked Fagin, looking covertly round, and knitting his shaggy eyebrows into a hard knot. You are right, Oliver, you're right. They will think you have stolen 'em. Ha, ha, chuckled the Jew, rubbing his hands. It couldn't have happened better, if we had chosen our time. Of course it couldn't, replied Sikes. I knowed that, directly I see him coming through Clerkenwell, with the books under his arm. It's all right enough. They're soft-hearted Sam Singers, or they wouldn't have taken him in at all, and they'll ask no questions after him, fear they should be obliged to prosecute, and so get him lagged. He's safe enough. Oliver had looked from one to the other, while these words were being spoken, as if he were bewildered, and could scarcely understand what passed, but when Bill Sikes concluded, he jumped suddenly to his feet, and tore wildly from the room, uttering shrieks for help, which made the bare old house echo to the roof. Keep back the dog, Bill, cried Nancy, springing before the door, and closing it, as the Jew and his two pupils darted out in pursuit. Keep back the dog, he'll tear the boy to pieces. Serve him right, cried Sikes, struggling to disengage himself from the girl's grasp. Stand off from me, or I'll split your head against the wall. I don't care for that, Bill, I don't care for that, screamed the girl, struggling violently with the man. The child shan't be torn down by the dog, unless you kill me first. Shan't he? Said Sikes, setting his teeth. I'll soon do that, if you don't keep off. The housebreaker flung the girl from him to the further end of the room, just as the Jew and the two boys returned, dragging Oliver among them. What's the matter here? Said Fagin, looking round. The girl's gone mad, I think, replied Sikes, savagely. No, she hasn't, said Nancy, pale and breathless from the scuffle. No, she hasn't, Fagin, don't think it. Then keep quiet, will you? Said the Jew, with a threatening look. No, I won't do that, neither, replied Nancy, speaking very loud. Come, what do you think of that, Mr. Fagin was sufficiently well acquainted with the manners and customs of that particular species of humanity to which Nancy belonged, to feel tolerably certain that it would be rather unsafe to prolong any conversation with her, at present. With the view of diverting the attention of the company, he turned to Oliver. So you wanted to get away, my dear, did you? Said the Jew, taking up a jagged and knotted club which lay in a corner of the fireplace. Eh? Oliver made no reply, but he watched the Jew's motions, and breathed quickly. Wanted to get assistance, called for the police, did you? Sneered the Jew, catching the boy by the arm. We'll cure you of that, my young master. The Jew inflicted a smart blow on Oliver's shoulders with the club, and was raising it for a second, when the girl, rushing forward, wrested it from his hand. She flung it into the fire, with a force that brought some of the glowing coals whirling out into the room. I won't stand by and see it done, Fagin, cried the girl. You've got the boy, and what more would you have? Let him be, or I shall put that mark on some of you, that will bring me to the gallows before my time. The girl stamped her foot violently on the floor as she vented this threat, and with her lips compressed, and her hands clenched, looked alternately at the Jew and the other robber, her face quite colorless from the passion of rage into which she had gradually worked herself. Why, Nancy, said the Jew, in a soothing tone, after a pause, during which he and Mr. Sikes had stared at one another in a disconcerted manner, you're more clever than ever tonight. Ha, ha, my dear, you are acting beautifully. Am I? Said the girl. Take care I don't overdo it. You will be the worse for it, Fagin, if I do. And so I tell you in good time to keep clear of me. There is something about a roused woman, especially if she add to all her other strong passions, the fierce impulses of recklessness and despair, which few men like to provoke. The Jew saw that it would be hopeless to affect any further mistake regarding the reality of Miss Nancy's rage, and, shrinking involuntarily back a few paces, cast a glance, half imploring and half cowardly, at Sikes, as if to hint that he was the fittest person to pursue the dialogue. Mr. Sikes, thus mutely appealed to, and possibly feeling his personal pride and influence interested in the immediate reduction of Miss Nancy to reason, gave utterance to about a couple of score of curses and threats, the rapid production of which reflected great credit on the fertility of his invention, as they produced no visible effect on the object against whom they were discharged. However, he resorted to more tangible arguments. What do you mean by this? Said Sikes, backing the inquiry with a very common imprecation concerning the most beautiful of human features, which, if it were heard above, only once out of every 50,000 times that it is uttered below, would render blindness as common a disorder as measles. What do you mean by it? Burn my body. Do you know who you are, and what you are? Oh, yes, I know all about it, replied the girl, laughing hysterically, and shaking her head from side to side, with a poor assumption of indifference. Well, then, keep quiet, rejoined Sikes, with a growl like that he was accustomed to use when addressing his dog, or I'll quiet you for a good long time to come. The girl laughed again, even less composedly than before, and, darting a hasty look at Sikes, turned her face aside, and bit her lip till the blood came. You're a nice one, added Sikes, as he surveyed her with a contemptuous air, to take up the humane and genteel side. A pretty subject for the child, as you call him, to make a friend of. God Almighty help me, I am, cried the girl passionately, and I wish I had been struck dead in the street, or had changed places with them we passed so near tonight, before I had lent a hand in bringing him here. He's a thief, a liar, a devil, all that's bad, from this night forth. Isn't that enough for the old wretch, without blows? Come, Sikes, said the Jew, appealing to him in a remonstratory tone, and motioning towards the boys, who were eagerly attentive to all that passed. We must have civil words, Bill. Civil words, cried the girl, whose passion was frightful to see. Civil words, you villain. Yes, you deserve 'em from me. I thieved for you when I was a child not half as old as this, pointing to Oliver. I have been in the same trade, and in the same service, for 12 years since. Don't you know it? Speak out. Don't you know it? Well, replied the Jew, with an attempt at pacification, and, if you have, it's your living. Aye, it is, returned the girl, not speaking, but pouring out the words in one continuous and vehement scream. It is my living, and the cold, wet, dirty streets are my home, and you're the wretch that drove me to them long ago, and that'll keep me there, day and night, till I die. I shall do you a mischief, interposed the Jew, goaded by these reproaches, a mischief worse than that, if you say much more. The girl said nothing more, but, tearing her hair and dress in a transport of passion, made such a rush at the Jew as would probably have left signal marks of her revenge upon him, had not her wrists been seized by Sikes at the right moment, upon which she made a few ineffectual struggles, and fainted. "She's all right now," said Sikes, laying her down in a corner. "She's uncommon strong in the arms, when she's up in this way." The Jew wiped his forehead, and smiled, as if it were a relief to have the disturbance over, but neither he, nor Sikes, nor the dog, nor the boys, seemed to consider it in any other light than a common occurrence incidental to business. "It's the worst of having to do with women," said the Jew, replacing his club, "but they're clever, and we can't get on, in our line, without 'em. Charlie, show Oliver to bed." "I suppose he'd better not wear his best clothes tomorrow, Fagin, had he?" inquired Charlie Bates. "Certainly not," replied the Jew, reciprocating the grin with which Charlie put the question. Master Bates, apparently much delighted with his commission, took the cleft stick, and led Oliver into an adjacent kitchen, where there were 2 or 3 of the beds on which he had slept before, and here, with many uncontrollable bursts of laughter, he produced the identical old suit of clothes which Oliver had so much congratulated himself upon leaving off at Mr. Brownlow's, and the accidental display of which, to Fagin, by the Jew who purchased them, had been the very first clue received, of his whereabout. "Put off the smart ones," said Charlie, "and I'll give 'em to Fagin to take care of." "What fun it is!" Poor Oliver unwillingly complied. Master Bates, rolling up the new clothes under his arm, departed from the room, leaving Oliver in the dark, and locking the door behind him. The noise of Charlie's laughter, and the voice of Miss Betsy, who opportunely arrived to throw water over her friend, and perform other feminine offices for the promotion of her recovery, might have kept many people awake under more happy circumstances than those in which Oliver was placed. But he was sick and weary, and he soon fell sound asleep. Chapter 17. Oliver's destiny continuing unpropitious, brings a great man to London to injure his reputation. It is the custom on the stage, in all good murderous melodramas, to present the tragic and the comic scenes, in as regular alternation, as the layers of red and white in a side of streaky bacon. The hero sinks upon his straw bed, weighed down by fetters and misfortunes. In the next scene, his faithful but unconscious squire regales the audience with a comic song. We behold, with throbbing bosoms, the heroine in the grasp of a proud and ruthless baron, her virtue and her life alike in danger, drawing forth her dagger to preserve the one at the cost of the other, and just as our expectations are wrought up to the highest pitch, a whistle is heard, and we are straightway transported to the great hall of the castle, where a grey-headed seneschal sings a funny chorus with a funnier body of vassals, who are free of all sorts of places, from church vaults to palaces, and roam about in company, carolling perpetually. Such changes appear absurd, but they are not so unnatural as they would seem at first sight. The transitions in real life from well-spread boards to deathbeds, and from mourning weeds to holiday garments, are not a whit less startling, only, there, we are busy actors, instead of passive lookers-on, which makes a vast difference. The actors in the mimic life of the theatre, are blind to violent transitions and abrupt impulses of passion or feeling, which, presented before the eyes of mere spectators, are at once condemned as outrageous and preposterous. As sudden shiftings of the scene, and rapid changes of time and place, are not only sanctioned in books by long usage, but are by many considered as the great art of authorship, an author's skill in his craft being, by such critics, chiefly estimated with relation to the dilemmas in which he leaves his characters at the end of every chapter. This brief introduction to the present one may perhaps be deemed unnecessary. If so, let it be considered a delicate intimation on the part of the historian that he is going back to the town in which Oliver Twist was born, the reader taking it for granted that there are good and substantial reasons for making the journey, or he would not be invited to proceed upon such an expedition. Mr. Bumble emerged at early morning from the workhouse gate, and walked with portly carriage and commanding steps, up the high street. He was in the full bloom and pride of beadlehood. His cocked hat and coat were dazzling in the morning sun. He clutched his cane with the vigorous tenacity of health and power. Mr. Bumble always carried his head high, but this morning it was higher than usual. There was an abstraction in his eye, an elevation in his air, which might have warned an observant stranger that thoughts were passing in the beadle's mind, too great for utterance. Mr. Bumble stopped not to converse with the small shopkeepers and others who spoke to him, deferentially, as he passed along. He merely returned their salutations with a wave of his hand, and relaxed not in his dignified pace, until he reached the farm where Mrs. Mann tended the infant paupers with parochial care. "Drat that beadle," said Mrs. Mann, hearing the well-known shaking at the garden gate. "If it isn't him at this time in the morning." "Lawk, Mr. Bumble, only think of its being you." "Well, dear me, it is a pleasure, this is. Come into the parlor, sir, please." The first sentence was addressed to Susan, and the exclamations of delight were uttered to Mr. Bumble, as the good lady unlocked the garden gate, and showed him, with great attention and respect, into the house. "Mrs. Mann," said Mr. Bumble, not sitting upon, or dropping himself into a seat, as any common jackanapes would, but letting himself gradually and slowly down into a chair. "Mrs. Mann, ma'am, good morning." "Well, and good morning to you, sir," replied Mrs. Mann, with many smiles, "and hoping you find yourself well, sir." So, Mrs. Mann," replied the beadle. "Our parochial life is not a bed of roses, Mrs. Mann." "Ah, that it isn't indeed, Mr. Bumble," rejoined the lady, and all the infant paupers might have chorused the rejoinder with great propriety, if they had heard it. "Our parochial life, ma'am," continued Mr. Bumble, striking the table with his cane, "is a life of worrit, and vexation, and hardihood, but all public characters, as I may say, must suffer prosecution." Mrs. Mann, not very well knowing what the beadle meant, raised her hands with a look of sympathy, and sighed. "Ah, you may well sigh, Mrs. Mann," said the beadle, finding she had done right. Mrs. Mann sighed again, evidently to the satisfaction of the public character, who, repressing a complacent smile by looking sternly at his cocked hat, said, "Mrs. Mann, I am going to London." "Lawk, Mr. Bumble," cried Mrs. Mann, starting back. "London, ma'am," resumed the inflexible beadle, "by coach. I and two paupers, Mrs. Mann. A legal action is a-coming on, about a settlement, and the board has appointed me, Mrs. Mann, to dispose to the matter before the quarter sessions at Clerkenwell. And I very much question," added Mr. Bumble, drawing himself up, "whether the Clerkenwell sessions will not find themselves in the wrong box before they have done with me." "Oh, you mustn't be too hard upon them, sir," said Mrs. Mann, coaxingly. "The Clerkenwell sessions have brought it upon themselves, ma'am," replied Mr. Bumble, "and if the Clerkenwell sessions find that they come off rather worse than they expected, the Clerkenwell sessions have only themselves to thank." There was so much determination and depth of purpose about the menacing manner in which Mr. Bumble delivered himself of these words, that Mrs. Mann appeared quite awed by them. At length she said, "You are going by coach, sir? I thought it was always usual to send them paupers in carts." "That's when they're ill, Mrs. Mann," said the beadle. "We put the sick paupers into open carts in the rainy weather, to prevent their taking cold." "Oh," said Mrs. Mann. "The opposition coach contracts for these too, and takes them cheap," said Mr. Bumble. "They are both in a very low state, and we find it would come £2 cheaper to move 'em than to bury 'em. That is, if we can throw 'em upon another parish, which I think we shall be able to do, if they don't die upon the road to spite us." "Ha, ha, ha!" When Mr. Bumble had laughed a little while, his eyes again encountered the cocked hat, and he became grave. "We are forgetting business, ma'am," said the beadle. "Here is your parochial stipend for the month." Mr. Bumble produced some silver money rolled up in paper, from his pocket-book, and requested a receipt, which Mrs. Mann wrote. "It's very much blotted, sir," said the farmer of infants, "but it's formal enough, I dare say." "Thank you, Mr. Bumble, sir, I am very much obliged to you, I'm sure." Mr. Bumble nodded, blandly, in acknowledgment of Mrs. Mann's curtsy, and inquired how the children were. "Bless their dear little hearts," said Mrs. Mann with emotion, "they're as well as can be, the dears, of course, except the two that died last week." "And little Dick, isn't that boy no better?" inquired Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Mann shook her head. "He's ill-conditioned, vicious, bad-disposed parochial child that," said Mr. Bumble angrily. "Where is he?" "I'll bring him to you in 1 minute, sir," replied Mrs. Mann. "Here, you Dick." After some calling, Dick was discovered, having had his face put under the pump, and dried upon Mrs. Mann's gown. he was led into the awful presence of Mr. Bumble, the beadle. The child was pale and thin, his cheeks were sunken, and his eyes large and bright. The scanty parish dress, the livery of his misery, hung loosely on his feeble body, and his young limbs had wasted away, like those of an old man. Such was the little being who stood trembling beneath Mr. Bumble's glance, not daring to lift his eyes from the floor, and dreading even to hear the beadle's voice. "Can't you look at the gentleman, you obstinate boy?" said Mrs. Mann. The child meekly raised his eyes, and encountered those of Mr. Bumble. "What's the matter with you, poor Dick?" inquired Mr. Bumble, with well-timed jocularity. "Nothing, sir," replied the child faintly. "I should think not," said Mrs. Mann, who had of course laughed very much at Mr. Bumble's humor. "You want for nothing, I'm sure." "I should like," faltered the child. "Hey day," interposed Mr. Mann, "I suppose you're going to say that you do want for something, now." "Why, you little wretch, stop, Mrs. Mann, stop," said the beadle, raising his hand with a show of authority. "Like what, sir, eh?" "I should like," faltered the child, "if somebody that can write would put a few words down for me on a piece of paper, and fold it up and seal it, and keep it for me, after I am laid in the ground." "Why, what does the boy mean?" exclaimed Mr. Bumble, on whom the earnest manner and one aspect of the child had made some impression, accustomed as he was to such things. "What do you mean, sir?" "I should like," said the child, "to leave my dear love to poor Oliver Twist, and to let him know how often I have sat by myself and cried to think of his wandering about in the dark nights with nobody to help him. And I should like to tell him," said the child, pressing his small hands together, and speaking with great fervor, "that I was glad to die when I was very young, for, perhaps, if I had lived to be a man, and had grown old, my little sister who is in heaven might forget me, or be unlike me, and it would be so much happier if we were both children there together." Mr. Bumble surveyed the little speaker, from head to foot, with indescribable astonishment, and, turning to his companion, said, "They are all in one story, Mrs. Mann." That audacious Oliver had demoralized them all. "I couldn't have believed it, sir," said Mrs. Mann, holding up her hands, and looking malignantly at Dick. "I never see such a hardened little wretch." "Take him away, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble imperiously. "This must be stated to the board, Mrs. Mann." "I hope the gentleman will understand that it isn't my fault, sir," said Mrs. Mann, whimpering pathetically. "They shall understand that, ma'am. They shall be acquainted with the true state of the case," said Mr. Bumble. "There, take him away. I can't bear the sight on him." Dick was immediately taken away, and locked up in the coal cellar. Mr. Bumble shortly afterwards took himself off, to prepare for his journey. At 6 o'clock next morning, Mr. Bumble, having exchanged his cocked hat for a round one, and encased his person in a blue greatcoat with a cape to it, took his place on the outside of the coach, accompanied by the criminals whose settlement was disputed, with whom, in due course of time, he arrived in London. He experienced no other crosses on the way than those which originated in the perverse behavior of the two paupers, who persisted in shivering and complaining of the cold, in a manner which, Mr. Bumble declared, caused his teeth to chatter in his head, and made him feel quite uncomfortable, although he had a greatcoat on. Having disposed of these evil-minded persons for the night, Mr. Bumble sat himself down in the house at which the coach stopped, and took a temperate dinner of steaks, oyster sauce, and porter. Putting a glass of hot gin and water on the chimney-piece, he drew his chair to the fire, and, with sundry moral reflections on the too prevalent sin of discontent and complaining, composed himself to read the paper. The very first paragraph upon which Mr. Bumble's eye rested was the following advertisement: 5 guineas reward. Whereas a young boy, named Oliver Twist, absconded, or was enticed, on Thursday evening last, from his home, at Pentonville, and has not since been heard of, the above reward will be paid to any person who will give such information as will lead to the discovery of the said Oliver Twist, or tend to throw any light upon his previous history, in which the advertiser is, for many reasons, warmly interested. And then followed a full description of Oliver's dress, person, appearance, and disappearance, with the name and address of Mr. Brownlow at full length. Mr. Bumble opened his eyes, read the advertisement, slowly and carefully, 3 several times, and in something more than 5 minutes was on his way to Pentonville, having actually, in his excitement, left the glass of hot gin and water untasted. "Is Mr. Brownlow at home?" inquired Mr. Bumble of the girl who opened the door. To this inquiry the girl returned the not uncommon, but rather evasive reply of "I don't know. Where do you come from?" Mr. Bumble no sooner uttered Oliver's name, in explanation of his errand, than Mrs. Bedwin, who had been listening at the parlor door, hastened into the passage in a breathless state. Come in," said the old lady. "I knew we should hear of him. Poor dear, I knew we should. I was certain of it. Bless his heart. I said so all along." Having heard this, the worthy old lady hurried back into the parlor again, and seating herself on a sofa, burst into tears. The girl, who was not quite so susceptible, had run upstairs meanwhile, and now returned with a request that Mr. Bumble would follow her immediately, which he did. He was shown into the little back study, where sat Mr. Brownlow and his friend Mr. Grimwig, with decanters and glasses before them. The latter gentleman at once burst into the exclamation, "A beadle, a parish beadle, or I'll eat my head." "Pray don't interrupt just now," said Mr. Brownlow. "Take a seat, will you?" Mr. Bumble sat himself down, quite confounded by the oddity of Mr. Grimwig's manner. Mr. Brownlow moved the lamp so as to obtain an uninterrupted view of the beadle's countenance, and said, with a little impatience, "Now, sir, you come in consequence of having seen the advertisement?" "Yes, sir," said Mr. Bumble. "And you are a beadle, are you not?" inquired Mr. Grimwig. "I am a parochial beadle, gentlemen," rejoined Mr. Bumble proudly. "Of course," observed Mr. Grimwig aside to his friend, "I knew he was a beadle all over." Mr. Brownlow gently shook his head to impose silence on his friend, and resumed, "Do you know where this poor boy is now?" "No more than nobody," replied Mr. Bumble. "Well, what do you know of him?" inquired the old gentleman. "Speak out, my friend, if you have anything to say. What do you know of him?" "You don't happen to know any good of him, do you?" said Mr. Grimwig, caustically, after an attentive perusal of Mr. Bumble's features. Mr. Bumble, catching at the inquiry very quickly, shook his head with portentous solemnity. "You see," said Mr. Grimwig, looking triumphantly at Mr. Brownlow. Mr. Brownlow looked apprehensively at Mr. Bumble's pursed-up countenance, and requested him to communicate what he knew regarding Oliver, in as few words as possible. Mr. Bumble put down his hat, unbuttoned his coat, folded his arms, inclined his head in a retrospective manner, and, after a few moments' reflection, commenced his story. It would be tedious if given in the beadle's words, occupying, as it did, some 20 minutes in the telling, but the sum and substance of it was, that Oliver was a foundling, born of low and vicious parents, that he had, from his birth, displayed no better qualities than treachery, ingratitude, and malice, that he had terminated his brief career in the place of his birth, by making a sanguinary and cowardly attack on an unoffending lad, and running away in the night time from his master's house. In proof of his really being the person he represented himself, Mr. Bumble laid upon the table the papers he had brought to town. Folding his arms again, he then awaited Mr. Brownlow's observations. "I fear it is all too true," said the old gentleman sorrowfully, after looking over the papers. "This is not much for your intelligence, but I would gladly have given you treble the money, if it had been favorable to the boy." It is not improbable that if Mr. Bumble had been possessed of this information at an earlier period of the interview, he might have imparted a very different coloring to his little history. It was too late to do it now, however, so he shook his head gravely, and, pocketing the 5 guineas, withdrew. Mr. Brownlow paced the room to and fro for some minutes, evidently so much disturbed by the beadle's tale, that even Mr. Grimwig forbore to vex him further. At length he stopped, and rang the bell violently. "Mrs. Bedwin," said Mr. Brownlow, when the housekeeper appeared, "that boy, Oliver, is an impostor." "It can't be, sir." "It cannot be," said the old lady energetically. "I tell you he is," retorted the old gentleman. "What do you mean by can't be? We have just heard a full account of him from his birth, and he has been a thorough-paced little villain, all his life." "I never will believe it, sir," replied the old lady, firmly. "Never. You old women never believe anything but quack doctors, and lying story books. growled Mr. Grimwig. "I knew it all along. Why didn't you take my advice in the beginning? You would if he hadn't had a fever, I suppose, eh? He was interesting, wasn't he?" "Interesting, bah!" And Mr. Grimwig poked the fire with a flourish. "He was a dear, grateful, gentle child, sir," retorted Mrs. Bedwin, indignantly. "I know what children are, sir, and have done these 40 years, and people who can't say the same shouldn't say anything about them. That's my opinion." This was a hard hit at Mr. Grimwig, who was a bachelor. As it extorted nothing from that gentleman but a smile, the old lady tossed her head and smoothed down her apron preparatory to another speech, when she was stopped by Mr. Brownlow. "Silence," said the old gentleman, feigning an anger he was far from feeling. "Never let me hear the boy's name again. I rang to tell you that. Never, never, on any pretense. Mind, you may leave the room, Mrs. Bedwin. Remember, I am in earnest." There were sad hearts at Mr. Brownlow's that night. Oliver's heart sank within him when he thought of his good friends. It was well for him that he could not know what they had heard, or it might have broken outright. Chapter 18. How Oliver passed his time in the improving society of his reputable friends. About noon next day, when the Dodger and Master Bates had gone out to pursue their customary avocations, Mr. Fagin took the opportunity of reading Oliver a long lecture on the crying sin of ingratitude, of which he clearly demonstrated he had been guilty, to no ordinary extent, in wilfully absenting himself from the society of his anxious friends, and, still more, in endeavoring to escape from them after so much trouble and expense had been incurred in his recovery. Mr. Fagin laid great stress on the fact of his having taken Oliver in, and cherished him, when, without his timely aid, he might have perished with hunger, and he related the dismal and affecting history of a young lad whom, in his philanthropy, he had succored under parallel circumstances, but who, proving unworthy of his confidence and evincing a desire to communicate with the police, had unfortunately come to be hanged at the Old Bailey one morning. Mr. Fagin did not seek to conceal his share in the catastrophe, but lamented with tears in his eyes that the wrong-headed and treacherous behavior of the young person in question had rendered it necessary that he should become the victim of certain evidence for the Crown, which, if it were not precisely true, was indispensably necessary for the safety of him, Mr. Fagin, and a few select friends. Mr. Fagin concluded by drawing a rather disagreeable picture of the discomforts of hanging, and, with great friendliness and politeness of manner, expressed his anxious hopes that he might never be obliged to submit Oliver Twist to that unpleasant operation. Little Oliver's blood ran cold, as he listened to the Jew's words, and imperfectly comprehended the dark threats conveyed in them. That it was possible even for justice itself to confound the innocent with the guilty when they were in accidental companionship, he knew already, and that deeply laid plans for the destruction of inconveniently knowing or over-communicative persons had been really devised and carried out by the Jew on more occasions than one. He thought by no means unlikely, when he recollected the general nature of the altercations between that gentleman and Mr. Sikes, which seemed to bear reference to some foregone conspiracy of the kind. As he glanced timidly up, and met the Jew's searching look, he felt that his pale face and trembling limbs were neither unnoticed nor unrelished by that weary old gentleman. The Jew, smiling hideously, patted Oliver on the head, and said, that if he kept himself quiet, and applied himself to business, he saw they would be very good friends yet. Then, taking his hat, and covering himself with an old patched greatcoat, he went out, and locked the room door behind him. And so Oliver remained all that day, and for the greater part of many subsequent days, seeing nobody, between early morning and midnight, and left during the long hours to commune with his own thoughts, which, never failing to revert to his kind friends, and the opinion they must long ago have formed of him, was sad indeed. After the lapse of a week or so, the Jew left the room door unlocked, and he was at liberty to wander about the house. It was a very dirty place. The rooms upstairs had great high wooden chimney pieces and large doors, with panelled walls and cornices to the ceiling, which, although they were black with neglect and dust, were ornamented in various ways. From all of these tokens Oliver concluded that a long time ago, before the old Jew was born, it had belonged to better people, and had perhaps been quite gay and handsome, dismal and dreary as it looked now. Spiders had built their webs in the angles of the walls and ceilings, and sometimes, when Oliver walked softly into a room, the mice would scamper across the floor and run back terrified to their holes. With these exceptions, there was neither sight nor sound of any living thing, and often, when it grew dark, and he was tired of wandering from room to room, he would crouch in the corner of the passage by the street door, to be as near living people as he could, and would remain there, listening and counting the hours, until the Jew or the boys returned. In all the rooms, the mouldering shutters were fast closed, the bars which held them were screwed tight into the wood, the only light which was admitted, stealing its way through round holes at the top, which made the rooms more gloomy, and filled them with strange shadows. There was a back-garret window with rusty bars outside, which had no shutter, and out of this, Oliver often gazed with a melancholy face for hours together, but nothing was to be descried from it but a confused and crowded mass of housetops, blackened chimneys, and gable ends. Sometimes, indeed, a grisly head might be seen, peering over the parapet wall of a distant house, but it was quickly withdrawn again, and as the window of Oliver's observatory was nailed down, and dimmed with the rain and smoke of years, it was as much as he could do to make out the forms of the different objects beyond, without making any attempt to be seen or heard, which he had as much chance of being, as if he had lived inside the ball of St. Paul's Cathedral. One afternoon, the Dodger and Master Bates being engaged out that evening, the first-named young gentleman took it into his head to evince some anxiety regarding the decoration of his person. To do him justice, this was by no means an habitual weakness with him, and, with this end and aim, he condescendingly commanded Oliver to assist him in his toilet. Straightway, Oliver was but too glad to make himself useful, too happy to have some faces, however bad, to look upon, too desirous to conciliate those about him when he could honestly do so, to throw any objection in the way of this proposal. So he at once expressed his readiness, and, kneeling on the floor, while the Dodger sat upon the table so that he could take his food in his laps, he applied himself to a process which Mr. Dickens designated as japanning his trotter cases. The phrase, rendered into plain English, signifieth cleaning his boots. Whether it was the sense of freedom and independence which a rational animal may be supposed to feel when he sits on a table in an easy attitude smoking a pipe, swinging one leg carelessly to and fro, and having his boots cleaned all the time, without even the past trouble of having taken them off, or the prospective misery of putting them on, to disturb his reflections, or whether it was the goodness of the tobacco that soothed the feelings of the Dodger, or the mildness of the beer that mollified his thoughts, he was evidently tinctured, for the nonce, with a spice of romance and enthusiasm, foreign to his general nature. He looked down on Oliver, with a thoughtful countenance, for a brief space, and then, raising his head, and heaving a gentle sign, said, half in abstraction, and half to Master Bates, "What a pity it is he isn't a prig." "Ah," said Master Charles Bates, "he don't know what's good for him." The Dodger sighed again, and resumed his pipe, as did Charlie Bates. They both smoked, for some seconds, in silence. "I suppose you don't even know what a prig is?" said the Dodger mournfully. "I think I know that," replied Oliver, looking up. "It's either, you're one, are you not?" inquired Oliver, checking himself. "I am," replied the Dodger. "I'd scorn to be anything else." Mr. Dickens gave his hat a ferocious cock, after delivering this sentiment, and looked at Master Bates, as if to denote that he would feel obliged by his saying anything to the contrary. "I am," repeated the Dodger. "So's Charlie, so's Fagin, so's Sykes, so's Nancy, so's Bet, so we all are, down to the dog. And he's the downiest one of the lot, and the least given to peaching," added Charlie Bates. "He wouldn't so much as bark in a witness box, for fear of committing himself. No, not if you tied him up in one, and left him there without victuals for a fortnight," said the Dodger. "Not a bit of it," observed Charlie. "He's a rum dog. Don't he look fierce at any strange cove that laughs or sings when he's in company?" pursued the Dodger. "Won't he growl at all when he hears a fiddle playing? And don't he hate other dogs as ain't of his breed?" "Oh, no, he's an out-and-out Christian," said Charlie. This was merely intended as a tribute to the animal's abilities, but it was an appropriate remark in another sense, if Master Bates had only known it, for there are a good many ladies and gentlemen, claiming to be out-and-out Christians, between whom, and Mr. Sykes' dog, there exist strong and singular points of resemblance. Well, well, said the Dodger, recurring to the point from which they had strayed, with that mindfulness of his profession which influenced all his proceedings. This hasn't got anything to do with young Green here. No more it has, said Charlie. Why don't you put yourself under Fagin, Oliver, and make your fortune out of hand? Added the Dodger, with a grin, and so be able to retire on your property, and do the genteel, as I mean to, in the very next leap year, but for that ever comes, and the 42nd Tuesday in Trinity week, said Charlie Bates. I don't like it, rejoined Oliver, timidly. I wish they would let me go. I would rather go, and Fagin would rather not, rejoined Charlie. Oliver knew this too well, but thinking it might be dangerous to express his feelings more openly, he only sighed, and went on with his boot cleaning. Go, exclaimed the Dodger. Why, where's your spirit? Don't you take any pride out of yourself? Would you go and be dependent on your friends? Oh, blow that, said Master Bates, drawing 2 or 3 silk handkerchiefs from his pocket, and tossing them into a cupboard. That's too mean, that is. I couldn't do it, said the Dodger, with an air of haughty disgust. You can leave your friends, though, said Oliver with a half-smile, and let them be punished for what you did. That, rejoined the Dodger, with a wave of his pipe, that was all out of consideration for Fagin, 'cause the traps know that we work together, and he might have got into trouble if we hadn't made our lucky. That was the move, wasn't it, Charlie? Master Bates nodded assent, and would have spoken, but the recollection of Oliver's flight came so suddenly upon him, that the smoke he was inhaling got entangled with a laugh, and went up into his head, and down into his throat, and brought on a fit of coughing and stamping, about 5 minutes long. Look here, said the Dodger, drawing forth a handful of shillings and halfpence. Here's a jolly life. What's the odds where it comes from? Here, catch hold, there's plenty more where they were took from. You won't you? Oh, you precious flat. It's naughty, ain't it, Oliver? Inquired Charlie Bates. He'll come to be scrad, won't he? I don't know what that means, replied Oliver. Something in this way, old fella, said Charlie. As he said it, Master Bates caught up an end of his neckerchief, and, holding it erect in the air, dropped his head on his shoulder, and jerked a curious sound through his teeth, thereby indicating, by a lively pantomimic representation, that scrying and hanging were one and the same thing. That's what it means, said Charlie. Look how he stares, Jack. I never did see such prime company as that air boy. He'll be the death of me, I know he will. Master Charlie Bates, having laughed heartily again, resumed his pipe with tears in his eyes. You've been brought up bad, said the Dodger, surveying his boots with much satisfaction when Oliver had polished them. Fagin will make something of you, though, or you'll be the first he ever had that turned out unprofitable. You'd better begin at once, for you'll come to the trade long before you think of it, and you're only losing time, Oliver. Master Bates backed this advice with sundry moral admonitions of his own, which, being exhausted, he and his friend Mr. Dorkins launched into a glowing description of the numerous pleasures incidental to the life they led, interspersed with a variety of hints to Oliver that the best thing he could do would be to secure Fagin's favor without more delay, by the means which they themselves had employed to gain it. And always put this in your pipe, Nolly, said the Dodger, as the Jew was heard unlocking the door above, if you don't take fogels and tickers. What's the good of talking in that way? Interposed Master Bates. He don't know what you mean. If you don't take pocket handkerchiefs and watches, said the Dodger, reducing his conversation to the level of Oliver's capacity, some other cove will, so that the coves that lose 'em will be all the worse, and you'll be all the worse, too, and nobody half a ha'porth the better, except the chaps what gets them, and you've just as good a right to them as they have. To be sure, said the Jew, who had entered unseen by Oliver. It all lies in a nutshell, my dear, in a nutshell, take the Dodger's word for it. Ha, ha, ha. He understands the catechism of his trade. The old man rubbed his hands gleefully together, as he corroborated the Dodger's reasoning in these terms, and chuckled with delight at his pupil's proficiency. The conversation proceeded no farther at this time, for the Jew had returned home accompanied by Miss Betsy, and a gentleman whom Oliver had never seen before, but who was accosted by the Dodger as Tom Chitling, and who, having lingered on the stairs to exchange a few gallantries with the lady, now made his appearance. Mr. Chitling was older in years than the Dodger, having perhaps numbered 18 winters, but there was a degree of deference in his deportment towards that young gentleman which seemed to indicate that he felt himself conscious of a slight inferiority in point of genius and professional acquirements. He had small twinkling eyes, and a pock-marked face, wore a fur cap, a dark corduroy jacket, greasy fustian trousers, and an apron. His wardrobe was, in truth, rather out of repair, but he excused himself to the company by stating that his time was only out an hour before, and that, in consequence of having worn the regimentals for 6 weeks past, he had not been able to bestow any attention on his private clothes. Mr. Chitling added, with strong marks of irritation, that the new way of fumigating clothes up yonder was infernal unconstitutional, for it burnt holes in them, and there was no remedy against the county. The same remark he considered to apply to the regulation mode of cutting the hair, which he held to be decidedly unlawful. Mr. Chitling wound up his observations by stating that he had not touched a drop of anything for 42 moral long hard-working days, and that he wished he might be busted if he won't as dry as a lime basket. "Where do you think the gentleman has come from, Oliver?" inquired the Jew, with a grin, as the other boys put a bottle of spirits on the table. I don't know, sir," replied Oliver. "Who's that?" inquired Tom Chitling, casting a contemptuous look at Oliver. "A young friend of mine, my dear," replied the Jew. "He's in luck, then," said the young man, with a meaning look at Fagin. "Never mind where I came from, young un, you'll find your way there, soon enough, I'll bet a crown." At this sally, the boys laughed. After some more jokes on the same subject, they exchanged a few short whispers with Fagin, and withdrew. After some words apart between the last comer and Fagin, they drew their chairs towards the fire, and the Jew, telling Oliver to come and sit by him, led the conversation to the topics most calculated to interest his hearers. These were the great advantages of the trade, the proficiency of the Dodger, the amiability of Charley Bates, and the liberality of the Jew himself. At length these subjects displayed signs of being thoroughly exhausted, and Mr. Chitling did the same, for the house of correction becomes fatiguing after a week or two. Miss Betsy accordingly withdrew, and left the party to their repose. From this day, Oliver was seldom left alone, but was placed in almost constant communication with the two boys, who played the old game with the Jew every day, whether for their own improvement or Oliver's. Mr. Fagin best knew. At other times the old man would tell them stories of robberies he had committed in his younger days, mixed up with so much that was droll and curious, that Oliver could not help laughing heartily, and showing that he was amused in spite of all his better feelings. In short, the wily old Jew had the boy in his toils. Having prepared his mind, by solitude and gloom, to prefer any society to the companionship of his own sad thoughts in such a dreary place, he was now slowly instilling into his soul the poison which he hoped would blacken it, and change its hue forever. Chapter 19, in which a notable plan is discussed and determined on. It was a chill, damp, windy night, when the Jew, buttoning his greatcoat tight round his shriveled body, and pulling the collar up over his ears so as completely to obscure the lower part of his face, emerged from his den. He paused on the step as the door was locked and chained behind him, and having listened while the boys made all secure, and until their retreating footsteps were no longer audible, slunk down the street as quickly as he could. The house to which Oliver had been conveyed was in the neighborhood of Whitechapel. The Jew stopped for an instant at the corner of the street, and, glancing suspiciously round, crossed the road, and struck off in the direction of the Spitalfields. The mud lay thick upon the stones, and a black mist hung over the streets. The rain fell sluggishly down, and everything felt cold and clammy to the touch. It seemed just the night when it befitted such a being as the Jew to be abroad. As he glided stealthily along, creeping beneath the shelter of the walls and doorways, the hideous old man seemed like some loathsome reptile, engendered in the slime and darkness through which he moved, crawling forth, by night, in search of some rich offal for a meal. He kept on his course, through many winding and narrow ways, until he reached Bethnal Green. Then, turning suddenly off to the left, he soon became involved in a maze of the mean and dirty streets which abound in that close and densely populated quarter. The Jew was evidently too familiar with the ground he traversed to be at all bewildered, either by the darkness of the night, or the intricacies of the way. He hurried through several alleys and streets, and at length turned into one, lighted only by a single lamp at the farther end. At the door of a house in this street, he knocked. Having exchanged a few muttered words with the person who opened it, he walked upstairs. A dog growled as he touched the handle of a room door, and a man's voice demanded who was there. "Only me, Bill, only me, my dear," said the Jew, looking in. "Bring in your body then," said Sikes. "Lie down, you stupid brute. Don't you know the devil when he's got a greatcoat on?" Apparently, the dog had been somewhat deceived by Mr. Fagin's outer garment, for as the Jew unbuttoned it, and threw it over the back of a chair, he retired to the corner from which he had risen, wagging his tail as he went, to show that he was as well satisfied as it was in his nature to be. "Well," said Sikes. "Well, my dear," replied the Jew. "Ah, Nancy." The latter recognition was uttered with just enough of embarrassment to imply a doubt of its reception, for Mr. Fagin and his young friend had not met, since she had interfered in behalf of Oliver. All doubts upon the subject, if he had any, were speedily removed by the young lady's behavior. She took her feet off the fender, pushed back her chair, and bade Fagin draw up his, without saying more about it, for it was a cold night, and no mistake. "It is cold, Nancy dear," said the Jew, as he warmed his skinny hands over the fire. "It seems to go right through one," added the old man, touching his side. "It must be a piercer, if it finds its way through your heart," said Mr. Sikes. "Give him something to drink, Nancy." "Burn my body, make haste. It's enough to turn a man ill, to see his lean old carcass shivering in that way, like a ugly ghost just rose from the grave." Nancy quickly brought a bottle from a cupboard, in which there were many, which, to judge from the diversity of their appearance, were filled with several kinds of liquids. Sikes, pouring out a glass of brandy, bade the Jew drink it off. "Quite enough, quite, thank I, Bill," replied the Jew, putting down the glass after just setting his lips to it. "What, you're afraid of our getting the better of you, are you?" inquired Sikes, fixing his eyes on the Jew. "Ugh!" With a hoarse grunt of contempt, Mr. Sikes seized the glass, and threw the remainder of its contents into the ashes, as a preparatory ceremony to filling it again for himself, which he did at once. The Jew glanced round the room, as his companion tossed down the second glassful, not in curiosity, for he had seen it often before, but in a restless and suspicious manner habitual to him. It was a meanly furnished apartment, with nothing but the contents of the closet to induce the belief that its occupier was anything but a working man, and with no more suspicious articles displayed to view than 2 or 3 heavy bludgeons which stood in a corner, and a life-preserver that hung over the chimney-piece. "There," said Sikes, smacking his lips. "Now I'm ready." "For business?" inquired the Jew. "For business," replied Sikes. "So say what you've got to say." "About the crib at Chertsey, Bill," said the Jew, drawing his chair forward, and speaking in a very low voice. "Yes." "What about it?" inquired Sikes. "Ah, you know what I mean, my dear," said the Jew. "He knows what I mean, Nancy, don't he?" "No, he don't," sneered Mr. Sikes. "Or he won't, and that's the same thing. Speak out, and call things by their right names. Don't sit there, winking and blinking, and talking to me in hints, as if you weren't the very first that thought about the robbery." "What d'ye mean?" "Hush, Bill, hush," said the Jew, who had in vain attempted to stop this burst of indignation. "Somebody will hear us, my dear, somebody will hear us." "Let 'em hear," said Sikes. "I don't care." But as Mr. Sikes did care, on reflection, he dropped his voice as he said the words, and grew calmer. There, said the Jew, coaxingly. "It was only my caution, nothing more. Now, my dear, about that crib at Chertsey, when is it to be done, Bill, eh? When is it to be done?" "Such plate, my dear, such plate," said the Jew, rubbing his hands, and elevating his eyebrows in a rapture of anticipation. "Not at all," replied Sikes coldly. "Not to be done at all," echoed the Jew, leaning back in his chair. "No, not at all," rejoined Sikes. "At least it can't be a put-up job, as we expected." "Then it hasn't been properly gone about," said the Jew, turning pale with anger. "Don't tell me." "But I will tell you," retorted Sikes. "Who are you that's not to be told? I tell you that Toby Crackit has been hanging about the place for a fortnight, and he can't get one of the servants in line." "Do you mean to tell me, Bill," said the Jew, softening as the other grew heated, "that neither of the 2 men in the house can be got over?" "Yes, I do mean to tell you so," replied Sykes. The old lady has had him these 20 years, and if you were to give him £500, they wouldn't be in it. But do you mean to say, my dear, remonstrated the Jew, that the women can't be got over? Not a bit of it, replied Sykes. Not by Flash Toby Crackit, said the Jew incredulously. Think what women are, Bill. No, not even by Flash Toby Crackit, replied Sykes. He says he's worn sham whiskers, and a canary waistcoat, the whole blessed time he's been loitering down there, and it's all of no use. He should have tried mustachios and a pair of military trousers, my dear, said the Jew. So he did, rejoined Sykes, and they want of no more use than the other plant. The Jew looked blank at this information. After ruminating for some minutes with his chin sunk on his breast, he raised his head and said, with a deep sigh, that if Flash Toby Crackit reported right, he feared the game was up. And yet, said the old man, dropping his hands on his knees, it's a sad thing, my dear, to lose so much when we had set our hearts upon it. So it is, said Mr. Sykes. Worse luck. A long silence ensued, during which the Jew was plunged in deep thought, with his face wrinkled into an expression of villainy perfectly demoniacal. Sykes eyed him furtively from time to time. Nancy, apparently fearful of irritating the housebreaker, sat with her eyes fixed upon the fire, as if she had been deaf to all that passed. Fagin, said Sykes, abruptly breaking the stillness that prevailed, is it worth 50 shiners extra, if it's safely done from the outside? Yes, said the Jew, as suddenly rousing himself. Is it a bargain? Inquired Sykes. Yes,